Today is June 17th, 2022, and the Arizona Department of Housing is hosting a HOME American Rescue Plan application workshop. This is our first ever HOME American Rescue Plan application workshop because as the department prepared to program this funding, some of you may be aware and participated with us on some listening sessions, but as we navigated launching this particular notice of funding opportunity, we found that there are significant challenges in utilizing this resource. It is a resource under the American Rescue Plan in response to COVID and relief thereto for stimulus funding. And we felt that this was really important to do for those interested in participating in this NOFA to have a clear understanding of the expectations of this program, this funding source, and moving forward from here. So we hope that you will find today very beneficial if you decide to move forward in submitting an application. So joining me today, I'm Ruby Dillon Williams, the Assistant Deputy Director of Programs for the department, is Sherry Boucher, our Rental Programs Administrator, and Martina Kuehl. Martina is our consultant to many things, specifically related to HUD and submitting our consolidated plan, and is going to also assist us in this HOME American Rescue Plan endeavor. So on the agenda for today, we're going to talk about the funding process and the application process. So it's going to be a very high level HOME American Rescue Plan overview. We're also going to spend some time, which is going to be really critical, is spending time on the application forms and attachments. And at the end, we're going to spend, we've allocated an hour. We might not use all that time for a question and answer session. So we ask that as we go through the presentation at the top of the session, we're going to push through, we're going to get through all of our slides, and then we're going to open it up for questions and answers. So if you have questions along the way, please keep note of that. And then we'll open up a formal Q&A session. Since we have over 40 participants, we think that's the best way for this to go today. So in that Q&A session, I just wanted to mention one more thing. We will try to provide as many clarifications as possible. If the question asked is very technical, we will follow up and we will post those clarifications publicly so that everyone that's on this call today and or others that weren't able to participate will see our response. Before we move to the next slide, potential applicants, we're asking you to please spend time reading the program summary, the underwriting guidelines, and the application instructions. We've spent a lot of time, Martina, thank you, putting those documents together, and we find that that will help you navigate through this process very quickly and just to get acclimated with this new funding source. So we can move to the next slide. So what is HOME American Rescue Plan? And you'll see there's this up on your screen, this circle with HOME adjacent to it. So both HOME and HOME American Rescue Plan are received by the Department of Housing from HUD. HOME-ARP, I want you to pay attention to that middle little section, that overlap. They are not one and the same. So for those of you that have worked with us and utilized HOME funding, HOME American Rescue Plan is very, very different. It is a new program and there's limited HUD guidance. So we have taken that HUD guidance. We've gone to other technical assistance programs that HUD has put out and try to best set you all up for success in utilizing this resource. But please know it's a new program, limited HUD guidance, and it is not identical to HOME. The requirements, the restrictions on the property that you submit are going to be very different. And we're going to walk through that today. So it's as we work through that HUD guidance, so far it's a very literal interpretation. That's the best way to describe it. So we're going to again provide you with the best guidance that we can today. And what I wanted to mention is those of you that are familiar with HUD programs, you know that there's those federal cross-cutting regulations, and there's rents and rent compliance that have to be adhered to. That is where you're going to see that primary overlap. So on that last slide where you saw the bubble or the circles overlap, that's where you're going to see it in that vein. So can we go back?
Yeah, I'm going back.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to give you next slide. We can go ahead and share the overview. For the Home-American Rescue Plan overview, we're going to talk about qualifying populations. We're going to talk about, we're going to spend that on this slide here. So I want to talk about that a little bit. So there's no one definition used for Home-American Rescue Plan for qualifying applications. I know, right? I'm not starting this off so positive, but I want you to know at the end of this, you're going to be ready to submit an application. So the most important thing to walk away with today is that income is only a factor for households at greatest risk of instability. All others are qualifying regardless of income. So homeless, at risk, and fleeing or attempting to flee are eligible regardless of income. And so I want to refer you to the homeless definition per the consolidated plan, which runs with our COC and with our ESG programs. And that's what I just talked about, except for fleeing or attempting to flee who have no other residence and lack of resources or support network. That's the definition that you're gonna glom onto. So they're at risk of homelessness definition is through the one that if you are participating with our COC would be familiar with that definition. So fleeing, attempting to flee domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, stalking, sex, labor trafficking. The definition per VAWA plus human trafficking definition from Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000. That's a lot, right? Just throwing that out there for you to go and further research these definitions to have a better understanding of what the qualifying populations are. So homeless or at risk of homelessness are not a factor there. And then other qualifying populations are other families requiring services or assistance to prevent homelessness, and then at risk of housing instability. This is where I want to drill down on 30% of AMI at severe cost burden and 50% AMI and meets one of the criteria in the consolidated plan definition of homelessness. Now I've said consolidated plan twice on this slide. So that's an ancillary document that I would have with you as you work through your application, as you work through the underwriting of this particular source, because we reference and cross-reference quite a bit with our consolidated plan when it comes to definitions. So I just want to make sure that you have that source document as you work through your application process. We can go ahead and go to the next slide. So HOME-ARP projects, and I'm going to shorten American Rescue Plan to ARP to make it a little bit easier to navigate here. So we have the non-congregate shelter bucket and we have the rental housing bucket. And again, the slides I'm going through right now are very high level. As Sherry jumps in and as Martina jump in, you'll get a little further into the weeds. So I'm going to talk about non-congregate shelter very high level. So two types of development activities. Both allow for new construction, acquisition, and or rehab. And both must begin within 12 months of ADOH agreement, signing an agreement with ADOH, and both must be occupied within 6 months of completion. This is really important, everyone. The COVID response and stimulus funding, they want quick action, right? So as you're looking at sites, if you're looking at new construction, if you're looking at rehab, keep this in mind. This is something you really, really want to highlight and zone in on. You must begin within 12 months of signing those agreements with ADOH, and you've got to be occupied within 6 months. Those are critical dates. There's no flexibility on asking for extensions and whatnot, because this is in response to COVID. They want folks in housing as quickly as possible. So there's in non-congregate shelter, there's no lease allowed. Rental housing though, the traditional home lease requirements, 12 months, et cetera, those do apply. So in that rental housing bucket, you can set up a lease structure. For non-congregate shelter, they have to be occupied by a qualifying population. We talked a little bit about that on the last slide, so I'm going to drill down a little bit more here. So for rental, not less than 70% of home American Rescue Plan units and up to 30% may be occupied by low-income households. Non-congregate shelters has 10 to 15 years restricted use period based on development activity added to it. And rental housing has a 15-year minimum of compliance period, regardless of the development activity. So let's go further into non-congregate shelter. No operating funds for non-congregate shelter. And you can do a capitalized operating reserve for rental. So it just depends on what think of this as your roadmap. If you're on the your non-congregate shelter side, you see those bullets that are your kind of roadmap. And if you're on the rental side, you kind of see what your requirements are about beginning construction, about the household requirements, and about the minimum compliance period. So last thing I want to mention is non-congregate shelter meets minimum habitability standards during the restricted use period, and rental meets property standards during minimum compliance period. So you want to really make sure that whatever path you decide to go down, if your contemplated project is a non-congregate shelter, that you're really paying attention to what you're going to obligate the project to for either 10 to 15 years or 15 years. It's just something to keep in mind. And if you're layering Home American Rescue Plan with other funding sources, you're going to want to make sure that restricted use period kind of aligns with the other funding sources that you have. So that's definitely something to keep in mind. We can go ahead to the next slide. So we're going to talk about the Home American Rescue Plan allocation, our allocation plan. So it was approved by HUD on March 8th, 2022. And a lot of you participated with us in listening sessions ahead of that submittal to HUD and then the subsequent approval by HUD. So we hope that you're familiar and you know that we received almost 22 million in Home American Rescue Plan. I think it was 21.8 million, just right below 22 million. Does not include preferences. So each project and activity must be made available to all qualifying populations. HUD issued guidance regarding preferences, priorities, and limitations, held a webinar mid-May. Like I said at the top of the call, we've been attending as many of these listening sessions that HUD has as well to try to walk you through this. So on this slide, yes, I am going fast. I'm a fast talker, Kenya, I'm sorry. So yes, these slides are going to be available after this. There's a lot of information, which is why we go until 1:45 today. So I am going through these slides very quickly, but once we get to the later slides, we're going to kind of slow down and really walk through submitting an application and how this information ties to that. So bear with me. I just want to make sure we spend a lot of time on the application process. So I want to get through this high level stuff pretty quickly. So ADOH will consider preferences or priorities, and a substantial amendment would be needed. And that would take at least 100 days. The process and approval from HUD, I'm sure Martina will shake her head, can be very quick or it can take very, very long. We just never know. So ADOH will not consider projects that limit, as HUD guidance suggests, that have potential fair housing concerns. So in any of your endeavors, if you're contemplating serving a specific population, we really, really need to be careful that we're not limiting or excluding certain populations or subpopulations. I think that's the biggest takeaway for me, at least from this slide, to convey to you, that we want to be really careful on that. So we want to make sure that if you're thinking about serving a specific population, you come to us early and talk about that to make sure that we're not going to have any issue. So we can go ahead, and you're only one more slide with me, and then I promise it'll slow down here. So I would just want to talk about the funding process and how this will work with coming to ADOH. Although I'm looking at Sherry and we're very similar in our presenting skills. So Sherry, this is a heads up to slow it down. So funding process. So we're going to accept applications. the department will conduct a completeness and threshold review. So once applications are accepted, it will go to an underwriter. And that's where we're going to review completeness and threshold. We're going to look at if any nonprofits requested operating or capacity building funds. We're going to look at the other applicants' requests, and then a conditional commitment will be issued. And that's then when you trigger into the more formal underwriting, where we go into the regulatory requirements. You're going to need a market demand study or needs assessment. We're going to look at that in the formal underwriting. We're going to look at owner and development team capacity, the project specifics, the details of the project, and then we're going to conduct a subsidy layering review. And that's required of us by HUD. So if you have other sources in the transaction, as I talked about, we call it the capital stack in the low-income housing tax credit world. If you have other funding, we have to look at that to really make sure there's no duplication of benefit. If you have other HUD funding, if you have other American Rescue Plan dollars, this is where we're going to look to make sure that the project is not over-subsidized. And after all of that formal underwriting is complete, that is when you're going to get a firm commitment for your project. And I wanted to make a distinction here between the conditional commitment and the firm commitment. I wanted to mention that the formal underwriting is when you get the firm commitment, because your other lending partners may ask, is the funding in the deal? And so we want to give you that conditional commitment early to let you know that yes, the department has received your application, it's under review, so you can give that to your other partners. And then when we get to underwriting, that's when we'll drill down into the analyses and give you that firm commitment. So this particular NOFA, and this is really important because we've received this question quite a bit over the last few weeks, is open to statewide opportunities, so across the state, until February 1st, 2023. If we do not receive an oversubscription, if funds still remain, then we will open it up to our metro communities. So the target at first will be our balance of state folks. Martina's going to go into that a little bit more when she gets to her slides. But with that, I'm going to pass it off to Sherry. She's our rental programs administrator. She is managing this notice of funding opportunity. So the applications, when you submit them, will flow through our rental division, which is managed by Sherry. So Sherry, do you want to take it from here?
Thank you, Ruby, and good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today on a Friday morning and coming over and learning about this new exciting HUD funding source, HOME-ARP. And so what I want to go through now is our application requirements for both the non-congregate shelter and the rental housing, and then also highlight the differences between the two, because there are some components that are required of rental that are not required of non-congregate shelter. So let's start with the easy one, the shorter list, right? Non-congregate shelter projects, or NCS, you'll see that referenced a lot throughout the presentation. Anytime you see NCS, that's non-congregate shelter. There's 12 tabs. Of course, you'll have your cover page or your cover letter, your checklist, and we'll go over where all of these forms are in a couple slides. So I will let y'all know, but we have these template forms for you and you'll be just filling them out. The checklist, our project and site information page, your timeline for the project, information on the cross-cutting regulations, which Ruby mentioned. When you're working with federal funds and say you have another source that's non-federal funds, this will federalize your project. So just be mindful that because you're working with HUD federal funds, you will be subject to those cross-cutting requirements. The project team and capacity information, development and funding sources. So in addition to your request for HOME-ARP, will you have any other sources in the project, documentation on that development budget, and then backup for those sources and those commitments? Your program description, so an overview, what will you be doing with this project? What will the scope look like? This will really help us, if we move on to funding, develop our scope for our funding agreement. So important to really spell out clearly what you're looking to do, who you're looking to serve, what the need is, and all of those good things. Number 10 is our operating budget. So after you get through the development process, how will you maintain the operating for this facility? So as Ruby mentioned, there isn't operating resources available for non-congregate shelters. So folks will need to come in with how that facility will be able to operate for that affordability period. So it's pretty important to highlight there. Supportive services. So with a non-congregate shelter, any information about the supportive services you'll be providing, who will be providing the supportive services, what their experience is with providing those specific supportive services for your targeted population. And then finally, the NPO operating and capacity building. So if you are looking for operating or capacity building for your organization itself, there would be that request and documentation there. And then for rental housing, let's get into it. What do we need for rental housing? You'll see there's a lot of similarities. We have the cover page again, checklist, project site, timeline. You'll see all of those are similar until we're getting down to number 9, where you see unit mix. And the reason why we have this is because you are developing a rental housing project that will have maybe 1 bedrooms, 2 bedrooms. We'll want to know the unit mix for your specific project. And I just see that Ruby linked into the chat for you all the website and the location of our NOFA, our application guidelines, our forms are there, and you'll also see the underwriting requirements too. We are recording this session as well, so we will post this session on the website as well, so you'll have the slides, and you can also reference our conversation here today. So if you want to go back to a specific slide and see what we said about that slide, you'll have that as a resource. Okay, so unit mix, that's for your proposed project, what will be your unit mix, your rent schedule for those units. So what you're proposing to the AMIs you're targeting and the rents associated with that, your operating budget to facilitate that rental housing for the affordability period, and then any operating reserve calculation. So as Ruby mentioned, the rental housing projects do have the ability to come in for an operating reserve to help maintain that operating over the affordability period. So something to support your calculation and the need for that. And then again, any requests for NPO operating and capacity building for the organization. And finally, supportive services as well. How will you be providing supportive services and who, what, where, when, all that good stuff related to supportive services. And here are the common application thresholds. So this is required of all applicants and all projects, is that you are receiving tribal consent, that it is non-speculative, and you are complying with, as we mentioned, the federal cross-cutting requirements. So we have that a few times. As you see, it can be a deal breaker for some folks. So we want to make sure we're very clear about the requirements there. And if you have any questions, we're here to help identify what those could be and how that would impact your project. Nonprofit and for-profit applications would need the certificate of good standing, your most recent financial statements, and your partnership or operating agreement specifying your ownership interest and cash contributions if a partnership or an LLC. That's specifically related usually to low-income housing tax credit projects. So if you're coming in and you know you'll be a non-LIHTC or a non-low-income housing tax credit project, you usually won't have an operating agreement or your partnership or LLC. But for nonprofits, we have the IRS, of course, nonprofit designation for your 501c3, 501c4, or your Section 905 subsidiary. And this is the link that Ruby was so gracious to share in the chat, but you also have it here in the presentation. And we took a snippet of the website and what it looks like, because as you navigate to that page, you'll see this is our rental development page, and we have a lot of information about our LIHTC program, some other NOFAs we have out. So you'll be specifically needing to navigate to this HOME-ARP NOFA section. And this is, as you can see, has our NOFA. It has has our non-congregate shelter application and our rental application. So it's two separate forms that we have for you. Also, to avoid confusion, you'll be selecting either your non-congregate shelter application in those forms filling out, and then your rental housing application. And as we went through the list, when we were going through the differences between the two applications, the forms themselves will have those tabs for you. So you won't have to kind of pull and say, oh no, do I need to do unit mix? The application forms will have the unit mix tab and have your operating information that you'll need to fill out. So it's very intuitive for you. The way Martina developed it was, made it easy, hopefully make it as easy as possible for y'all to fill out. We also have the fun. Oh yeah.
Can I just jump in real quick? I also wanted to mention that we've been asked this a lot. So we will also have we have a page, and I'm going to link it in just a second, that shows as applications come in and funds are depleted, it'll show you what funds remain. So it's a little thermometer that we have with that shows all of the funding sources that the department currently has available. And so that way you'll know. So if you don't come in right away, you can go on there and see what's left of the 22 million to make the decision whether to come in or not. So I'm also going to link the page to show that analysis, as well as you can save that for future reference.
Oh, that's a good point, Ruby. One of the pieces of feedback we got from our stakeholders is that they love all these NOFAs coming out, but they don't know where the funding is and if there's funding left, right? So we developed this tracker that is the communication tool for our outside stakeholders to see, is there any money left? Is it worth it for me to, because we know it's heavy lifting to put these applications together, and we don't want you all to, go through that heavy lifting if it's already been depleted. So thank you, Ruby, great point. And then we have, as we already mentioned, the underwriting guidelines and of course the application guidelines to take a look at. What you'll notice is the NOFA is pretty brief when you read it. Really a lot of the bulk of the information you'll find, how to apply, what the application requirements is in the application guidebook. It even goes through the tabs for you and explains how to fill out the tabs. So it's very, very helpful. And then, thank you, Martina. And then finally, we have how do you submit your application? Everything is fully electronic. We are going away from paper submittals, which we're hoping makes everybody's life easier. And you'll be submitting through our portal. So we have a link here to how to submit to the rental portal. And you'll specify, as we have circled there, other, and then specify that it is for the HOME-ARP NOFA. We have had a couple questions about the portal and people's trying to submit and it's not working. Make sure you have all of the fields filled out, otherwise it will not let you move on to submitting through the portal. And that is all I have today. It's great to see so many people participating and interested in our HOME-ARP NOFA, and I will pass it on to Martina. So thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Sherry and Ruby. So I'm going to start, I'm going to walk through the entire application with you, and there are basically 4 eligible activities. If you heard Ruby talking about non-congregate shelter versus rental housing, those are the 2 development activities. And then there's 2 what I would call softer activities, and that's the nonprofit operating cost and capacity building assistance and the supportive services. And I'm actually going to start with those softer activities so you can understand kind of how things relate, and then we'll get into those more complicated application forms related to non-congregate shelter and rental housing. There's a lot of overlap between the non-congregate shelter application and the rental housing application. So as I'm going through these, I'm going to start, after I'm done with the soft activities, I'm going to start with the non-congregate shelter, let you know, like, this is different for rental, this is nothing's different. And then we'll talk about the rental housing. After that, it is the most complicated activity. I anticipate it will have the most questions associated with it. And that'll give us an opportunity to take that little break after the workshop and then come back and do some Q&A. If while I'm talking, there is something that you would like me to clarify, a non-technical question, please do put that in the chat. Ruby and Sherry are monitoring that. for me, and I will go back and clarify. It's a highly technical question, as Ruby stated. We're going to try and answer as many of those as we can during the Q&A session this afternoon. However, we may end up having to put out some kind of written guidance associated with those questions. We are really running with the HOME-ARP program. There is, yes.
I'm so sorry to interrupt. I'm just going to try to catch some of these questions.
Okay.
There was a question when you go forward with the slide about having any market units available in the, I would imagine that would be on the rental activity side, but if you can address that at some point. Sorry.
Yeah, let me just answer that now. Yes, okay. You can have market units. You can have any mix that you would like, as long as you are obviously including HOME-ARP units in your project if you're asking for HOME-ARP funds. So it could be all market with a few HOME-ARP is technically something that could happen, yes. Okay, so the other thing I wanted to mention was the funding process and the NOFA and where the funds are available initially. So initially, the funds are available only outside of the counties that have HOME-ARP allocation themselves. So the home PJs are all in Maricopa County, Pima County, Pinal County recently became a home PJ, and Yuma County has a consortium. So we would be looking outside of those 4 counties. So we really are looking primarily at the rural counties for this initial push into providing HOME-ARP funding. So along with that is one of the things that we're really excited to be able to offer, because it often is not offered, is that nonprofit operating cost and capacity building assistance. And I wanted to start with it because there's a few benefits if you're a nonprofit organization and you're looking to take on a non-congregate shelter or rental housing project. You actually have longer to implement the project. So you actually have up to 24 months to implement. And during that time, you can be receiving HOME-ARP funding for operating costs or for capacity building. And so that extra time could be very valuable, especially since we are kind of intermittently receiving additional guidance on HOME-ARP, and we're taking a very ultra conservative and literal approach as we move forward. So you do have to have an identified site or sites, because one of the things that happens with nonprofit operating and capacity building assistance is if your project doesn't move forward, you have to repay the funds. That's the way that the department has set it up. The funds are tied to project implementation. So if you are a nonprofit operating in a rural area and you're interested in taking on a development project, this is a good opportunity for you to get some support for operating, as well as for capacity building to do development or to provide supportive services for HOME-ARP qualifying populations. So keep that in the back of your mind. When you are completing the application, you are going to have to do the cover page and you are going to have to do the checklist, but there are totally different thresholds for nonprofit organizations who are applying for the operating cost and capacity building assistance than there are for all other projects. So basically, just having an identified site is what we're looking for, or sites. You might have more than one that you're looking at that you want to research during that 24 months that you have to actually implement something. So keep that in mind, that you have to have the project and you want to still be able to do the cover page and the checklist, but you have a lot of opportunity to use the funds, and the department will provide an allocation to you and then work with you and provide technical assistance to help you get to that point where you can implement. Ruby, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I'm going to do that, Martina, if that is helpful so I don't cut you off. There's a question about, can a nonprofit already operating a non-congregate shelter apply for operating funds?
It has to be associated with a HOME-ARP project. So the answer to that is, unless you're applying for HOME-ARP funds, no. Okay, so you're also going to want to be completing rental housing tab 13, which is the NPO operating capacity building, or the non-congregate shelter tab 12. Some of the things that you do absolutely have to submit: the certificate of good standing. We need to know that you're in good standing with the Arizona Corporation Commission. Your proof of IRS nonprofit designation, and that can be a 501c3, 501c4, or a 905 subsidiary. Again, that partnership or LLC agreement, if you've structured your project as a partnership or LLC, tribal government consent, your most recent financial statements, and this is going to come into play as we look at whether or not we believe the organization is going to be able to move forward with an actual project, because the last thing we want to do, of course, is provide this kind of funding and then have to try and recapture it from a nonprofit organization. And then there's two types of budgets that you might submit: a board-approved fiscal year operating budget or a program operating budget. And for some nonprofits, those go hand in hand. And I'm going to give you kind of an example of what that might look like when I show you how this funding works. But the nonprofit does have to have board approval of that fiscal year budget, and the funds are provided on the nonprofit's fiscal year budget. So if you have a January 1st start date, it's going to be that particular budget year that the department is going to be looking at. So I want to make a distinction between operating cost funding and capacity building funding. Both of them, the department, as I mentioned, will provide an allocation, and then those funds will be released to you incrementally, assuming that you're making progress. And that is the reason for the incremental release of the funds. You won't get a lump sum. We want to make sure that we're working closely with you to make whatever project vision you have a reality. Both funds, either fund, you can get up to $50,000 a fiscal year from either operating cost assistance or capacity building assistance. If you're asking for both, the combined maximum is going to be $75,000 or 50% of your general operating budget. And I'm going to make that distinction between a general operating budget and an organization or program operating budget. The Department of Housing is capping the operating cost funding at 5 years. So you could get up to $250,000 for operating funds over the course of 5 years. And the capacity building fund is capped at 4 years. And the reason that it's a shorter period is by 4 years, you should have your project in the ground. You should have collected your developer fee from developing and implementing the project. And so at that point in time, we would expect that you are going to be working towards hopefully your next project and the continued receipt of fees for the services and development that you are completing. So operating cost funding is not tied to any program, project, or activity undertaken. So it really says, what is our big overall operating expenses that are not allocated to any specific program or project. And then the operating funds are for general administration and operating only. So that can be staff funding, it'd be training and travel, office space, utilities, those sorts of things, and other general operating. So to distinguish capacity building funding from that, the capacity building funding is tied directly to building your organization's capacity to carry out the HOME-ARP project. So what we want to see there is new staff. You might be reassigning staff and they don't have the skills or the knowledge to take on a development project or to work with a HOME-ARP qualifying population. So it can be staff development, trainings, the skill building necessary to actually do development. If you're needing equipment upgrades, hardware and software upgrades, anything along those lines that's going to improve your organizational processes to support the HOME-ARP development and any future development. And then technical assistance and consultant capacity building contracts. And so I want to distinguish here between a capacity building contract and a development contract. So if you want to hire a consultant to work on the HOME-ARP project for you, that comes out of your developer fee. If you want to hire a consultant to work with your board and your organization to prepare you to be a development organization or to better serve one of the qualifying populations, then that type of contract would be eligible, but not the contract related to the actual development. So it's all about you helping you gain the skills and the knowledge necessary to be successful with a HOME-ARP project. And unfortunately, these are one-time funds. If you are a nonprofit organization and you are thinking that you want to get into the development business, I think this is a great opportunity to build that capacity and to get some support for your organization. And I would ask you to kind of keep in the back of your mind in the regular home program there as a community housing development organization or CHODO set aside. The department may in the future consider continuing to provide this capacity building and operating cost assistance through the regular home program for CHODOs. So you may want to be thinking, do I want to do a little extra work perhaps to become CHODO certified during this process so that you can continue to access the state set aside for CHODO funds. And this is really a need in rural areas, and we recognize that. And so we want to encourage you to think long-term about building your development capacity. So here's a very simple nonprofit organization fiscal year budget. So you can see that this has 3 columns. It has a column of agency, and then this particular organization also operates a couple of programs. So the program funding is really taken out of the equation when the department looks at how much operating or capacity building assistance they might provide to you. So in this particular organization, the total agency expenses, those are that general operating expenses, are a little over $200,000. So that is the amount that is going to be looked at as that maximum of $50,000 or 50% of the operating budget. So in this case, $50,000 would be the particular cap on that. So I also want you to note that you could look at here. I don't know if you can see my pointer or not. So when you're talking about capacity building funding, you're really looking at, here's that new staff. And so that new staff person with their ERE is going to run you $67,000 in this case. So remember, you can't get more than $50,000, but $50,000 could be used to cover this particular person's salary. And then this other is the contract services. And that would be perhaps the consultant who's helping your new development coordinator to gain skills. So if you wanted to, you could say, well, we're going to go for the full $75,000. You could say, we're going to ask for $50,000 in capacity building funds for the 4 years, and then the operating funds an additional $25,000, and then another $50,000 in year 5. So you could actually be looking at somewhere in the neighborhood of $250,000 over the 5-year period to help support your organization and get you rolling in development. So that was a very simple overview of nonprofit operating cost and capacity building assistance. And I'm hoping that if you are a nonprofit organization and you're really looking closely at this, or you want that, you will contact the department to talk with them about how to make this work, because it is I think perhaps a one-time opportunity to really get something going for you. So the next soft activity that I want to discuss with you is HOME-ARP supportive services. And when we're done with this particular conversation, we are going to take a break. I need one, and you probably need one from my voice. So bear with us while we go through that this process. Oh, well, if I can. There we go. Okay, so supportive services. This is right now the only way to access supportive services funding is in conjunction with an application for NCS or rental housing. So but it's a little weird in that you cannot limit the funding to the occupants of that particular project. We want you to be able to provide those services kind of broader in the community. So think about it, as a bigger, yes, these funds are available to the people who are going to occupy our particular project, and we're going to make them available outside of that. That small group of people who will probably be occupying the property. It's a voluntary activity. There is no requirement that you provide supportive services. Some people are saying they don't want the federal funding for supportive services. It really depends upon what's available in your community to work with qualifying population. Some are saying we only want the supportive services, but there's really two types of supportive services that the Department of Housing is willing to fund through its HOME-ARP funds. So the first is kind of the ESG services. So if you participate with the Emergency Solutions Grant Program, you are familiar with the services that are available to qualifying populations who are homeless, they're at risk of homelessness, or housed, and their services are going to help them to regain housing stability or move into some other type of permanent housing. So the list of ESG services is actually quite long. And the department does not allow all kinds of ESG services. It does limit the services that it will provide funding for. For example, in the ESG program, you can provide rapid rehousing assistance. You can have this longer term assistance, and we are not providing that through HOME-ARP. There's simply not enough funding there to provide long-term rental assistance. So the second type of supportive service that the department will entertain a request for is housing counseling provided by a HUD-certified housing counseling agency. So this is all of the rental side of the housing counseling that is allowed to be provided by HUD housing counseling agencies. Cannot do any home buyer or homeowner types of counseling. So this can be providing an action plan, developing an action plan for people to become stably housed. And that actually can happen through either type of eligible supportive service. Just how they're defined is a little bit different. If you have a HUD housing counseling agency that you want to work with, they can tell you exactly what it is that they can and cannot do. So I want to spend a few minutes talking about capacity. If you're a developer and you don't provide supportive services, typically you probably don't have that experience in capacity, and you're going to want to partner with or contract with an entity that does have that experience. The department is not going to provide supportive services funding to an entity that doesn't have experience providing supportive services. So if you don't have it yourself, look around in your community, look for an entity that you can work with. So the services can be provided by any of three types of entities. So you as the applicant can provide them if you have that capacity. If you're a nonprofit organization, you may or may not have that capacity. But you can directly provide the HOME-ARP services. In general, when that is the case, when you are applying for both development and supportive services, you will have a development agreement for the development piece of it, and then you will have a subrecipient agreement for the services side of things. So the next option is a subrecipient entity. So that's an entity that you have as an applicant you are working with that is going to provide the services to the qualifying populations. And they will either have a subrecipient agreement directly with the department, or the department will place that responsibility on you to monitor their supportive services activities. It's really going to depend upon who you are as an applicant and what that relationship is. There's a lot to providing supportive services and the reporting requirements, and we just want to make sure that we're not losing track of what's going on with the services. The third potential provider of supportive services is going to be a contractor. So a contractor is going to be somebody who has been generally competitively procured. They usually work on a fee-for-service basis. So an example of a contractor might be a licensed childcare provider to whom you will be paying for childcare for the qualifying populations that are either in shelter or residing in a rental development. They're getting a fee for service. They get paid by the day, they get paid by the week, perhaps by the month, however that works. So when you think about a contractor, you're thinking about somebody who is a very separate third party organization that you formally have a formal relationship with, and they have absolutely no responsibility for determining whether or not the people that they're working with are a qualifying population. So that responsibility for determining that the person receiving the services is HOME-ARP eligible is going to fall back to you as the applicant, or to a subrecipient entity if you're working with a subrecipient entity. And I wanted to make that distinction very clear. It's one of the things that gets a lot of people in trouble with HUD funding, is when we start to mix those two kind of definitions of what's a subrecipient, what's a contractor, how are these relationships working. So we want you to really think through how services will be provided, and we're going to ask you a lot of questions about how those services will be provided. So when you get into the application, you're going to see that it's going to allow you to say yes or no. We're requesting supportive services funding. If you say no, you just move on from this tab, and it's one less thing for you to do in the application itself. We're going to ask you, is it going to be provided by you as the applicant or some kind of a third party entity? And there is a drop down menu, and so you'll just, for every service you're going to provide, you're going to say whether or not it's you as the applicant or some kind of a third party. We want to know if it's an on-site service or an off-site service, how many people you're going to help, and what the proposed direct cost is going to be. The HOME-ARP program technically goes away on September 30th, 2030. So we have about 8 years to actually spend through the HOME-ARP funding. So whatever, when you're thinking about supportive services, you have to understand that they're not going to be available. Say you're doing a rental housing project, they're not going to be available throughout the minimum compliance period. They're only going to be available to you for the first 8 years. So, or probably less, because obviously it's going to take a while to get the development in the ground. So you have to be thinking, again, long-term, that these funds are good, and they're a good way to get a start, but you're going to have to be thinking about how are we going to continue to help people after HOME-ARP funding goes away. Important question. Regardless of the types of supportive services that you might be providing, there always has to be somebody determining that the individual or family receiving the assistance is indeed a HOME-ARP qualifying population. So that determination has to be made. That's number one. And there's really, you're not really going to get paid for that. And it's kind of, because you don't know yet. Once somebody is determined qualified, absolutely yes. And maybe through marketing and outreach and other efforts, you can, reduce the likelihood that you're going to get people who are not qualified. But beware that is step number one. Step number two, whenever providing supportive services, is doing an assessment of services needs and any existing services that have been secured by the individual or family. So there is a no duplication of benefits requirement in this program. This means that if somebody is receiving substance use services today, you cannot turn around and cancel those and start using HOME-ARP funding to next provide new substance use services through your contractor or your subrecipient or with whoever you have a relationship with. So it's very important to understand no supplanting. Now, if a resource is limited, a service is limited, and it's going to expire sometime in the future, and then upon expiration, absolutely, you could look at providing HOME-ARP funded supportive services at that point in time. Ruby.
I just wanted to jump in, Martina, because I use duplication of benefits with respect to funding sources, and then you used it differently here in this context. So I didn't want to confuse anybody. If you could just kind of make that distinction when we talk about it, because it is critical to make sure that we also are monitoring it as a funding source as well.
Right. So, yeah, when you think about duplication of benefits, we want to make sure that we're not duplicating. It's really more of a subsidy layering thing. We're wanting to make sure that we're not putting, one more penny of HOME-ARP funding into a project than is absolutely necessary to make it work. So we're not going to allow for additional HOME-ARP funding and basically duplicating, funding that you already have. The other side is this duplication of benefit to the actual beneficiary. So the beneficiary can only be receiving assistance through supportive services assistance through one source at a time. So we just want to make that distinction for you. So the worksheet, when you go through the worksheet, obviously this is what the top of it is going to look like. And then as you go down, you'll see there's the whole list of what the services that ADO is indeed willing to fund. So I wanted to take just a minute and talk a little bit about how the supportive services piece that related to rental application fees, security and utility deposits, moving costs, the sorts of things that help people to gain housing stability. So these are all eligible funding sources under HOME-ARP. We would envision that if you are a NCS developer or NCS provider, that you would be using HOME-ARP funding to help people gain stable housing. And they're not going to stay in the shelter forever. And we don't want them doing that. So you can use the HOME-ARP supportive services funding to help people move from the shelter to a stable housing situation. So there is that ability to reach out to landlords and do liaison services. A lot of you have been, supportive services providers have been working this hard through ESG CV over the years, really creating those relationships with landlords. So this money can still be used for that. And then it can also be used for all of the reasonable and customary fees that any applicant might encounter when they're looking to move into a permanent rental housing situation. This is where the department, however, stops and says, we're not going to provide longer term assistance. We're going to help people get into housing, but we don't have the financial resources to continue to provide that assistance long term. And I see your hand, Ruby, and I'll get to you in just a minute. The other piece of this that you want to be aware of is if you're doing a rental project, is that, yes, indeed, the supportive services funding, the HOME-ARP funding can be used to pay security, utility deposits, moving costs, whatever might be customarily charged in the project. So if you have a qualifying population, the funding could be used to help people meet those initial occupancy or tenancy requirements that you might have. A word of caution, it cannot be limited to just people moving into your project. So this is probably a good time to think about how you might partner with another entity to make sure those resources are available not only to your project, but to other qualifying populations in the community. Ruby.
We had a question in the chat. Are we able to offer other resources to tenants as well? Say something like a wellness program?
Yes, so there is the application itself, because there's about 30 eligible activities, I did not attempt even to screenshot that entire thing. So yes, there's a very long list of services: life skills, wellness, mental health, health services, educational services. You can help people get through a job development program, get gainful employment. So there is a very long list of opportunities there. I think one of the other things that has come up and in terms of questions is we're gonna be doing permanent supportive housing, and we're gonna have a resident services manager on site, and how do we pay for that resident services manager? It is going to be an eligible cost, and it is a kind of a case management and service provision cost. But again, you have to be very aware that it's only going to be for the HOME-ARP qualifying populations in a project. So just a word of caution on that. One of the to use Ruby's word, wonky things about HOME-ARP, and when you're looking at delivering services, is you're going to have a direct cost of service. Obviously, a first and last month's rent is it's a set amount, or an estimated amount, and so you're going to guess what that is. But when you start to look at how are you going to pay to provide those services, this goes back to having to track people's time and the time that is dedicated to serving HOME-ARP qualifying populations. So we're going to ask you, who's your provider? And there's room for multiple providers, and you can see that provider one name is in there multiple times. Got a little ahead of myself maybe when I saved the application, but so we're going to ask you to provide information on the position, the hourly rate, including any employee related expenses, and how many hours a year you think they're going to be working and serving HOME-ARP qualifying populations, and then how many years are you going to provide the service. And then the spreadsheet will automatically calculate how much of the cost is related to staff time. So because of the way this is set up, I think that it behooves you as an applicant to find a subrecipient or a contractor. Obviously, with a contractor, you're going on a fee-for-service kind of basis, so you're not going to be tracking what it costs you to actually deliver a service. But for pretty much all other services, there has to be a tracking. So if you have a case manager and they're working at your non-congregate shelter, and they're also providing services out into the community to people who might not be HOME-ARP qualified as HOME-ARP qualifying population, only their time associated with assisting HOME-ARP beneficiaries is going to be chargeable. So there's a lot of tracking involved with this. So it is a big piece of the capacity that's going to be necessary to implement HOME-ARP supportive services. So you want to have a fairly sophisticated tracking system in place. And it may very well be that supportive services are best offered by an entity that is currently delivering ESG services or is a HUD housing counseling agency because they're going to be familiar with how this works and what the reporting requirements and eligibility requirements are. I don't think it's something that you want to like take on as a new thing. That's just my opinion, but there are people much braver than I who are willing to do just that. So, all right. So about the thresholds, you have to be submitting a project application. You're going to have to fill out the tab for the supportive services. We're going to want to see as required attachments, any agreements with service providers. We're going to want to see the waiting list procedures. So I want to go back for a moment to this early discussion high level discussion where Ruby mentioned no preferences, no priorities, no limitations. Because there are no preferences in the state's HOME-ARP allocation plan, everybody gets placed on a waiting list and you choose from the top of the waiting list in chronological order. Now, if you decide you want to try and do a project with preferences and we end up doing a substantial amendment to the allocation plan, then those waiting list procedures will provide for preferences. So, but for now, just assume that it's kind of a first come, first serve, as long as somebody's a HOME-ARP qualifying population. You can start providing services from the top of the list specifically. Due process procedures are also required. So what this means is if you deny services to somebody, you terminate services to somebody, you do have to have due process procedures in place. If you don't have due process procedures, or your subrecipient or contractor doesn't have due process procedures, actually not contractor, subrecipient, or you as an applicant, you can look at the HOME-ARP program summary. There's due process procedures in there. What we're going to be looking for are your due process procedures that you're attaching to the application, are they substantially similar to those required by the ADO in its HOME-ARP program summary? Okay. So I do not talk as fast as Ruby or Sherry, but we are going to take a break. It is 10:07. I would like us to return by 10:15, please. So that gives us just a few minutes.
If everybody wants to make their way back, Martina will be jumping on again in just a second.
All right, welcome back, everybody. 10:15 on the nose. Before I move into discussing non-congregate shelter, going through the application forms with you, I wanted to take a moment and see if there were any lingering clarifications from the supportive services or nonprofit operating capacity building assistance sections. Looks like not. So excellent. So let's talk about HOME-ARP non-congregate shelter. New program, new activity. Non-congregate shelter would not be something that you would be doing with regular home funds. So all of this is absolutely new to us. Whoa, and new to you. So, all right. My computer is apparently, there we go. All right. So on the cover page, and this cover page is going to look almost identical on the rental housing application. We're really going to be asking you for general information about who you are and where your project is, what its name is, where it's located, if it has an address, the address, if it doesn't have an address, the legal description of the property, or you know, some other method of us identifying the actual location of the project. So we're going to be asking for that. You'll see in there a question about whether or not the applicant is an HMIS participant. And I want you to be clear that when you are serving a qualifying population that is homeless or at risk of homelessness, we are going to be asking you to use HMIS, because we want to be making, it's one way of making sure, A, that there's not a duplication of benefits, and B, making sure that we have information in that data sharing system about the beneficiary. And that's a good method for everybody to know what's going on with that individual or family. We're going to ask you in the cover page if you have, if you want to provide a preference or a priority to any qualifying population, and it's going to tell you stop here and call the department, because that's when we're going to go back and we're going to say, all right, you know, it looks like we're going to ask you lots of questions about your project. We may ask you to submit part of the application or the entire application before we consider how we might move forward with substantial amendment to the allocation plan. So there's a list of information that you're going to have to provide, and that information is going to include data that helps support that preference. You know, we looked at preferences. There was none that really came up in the listening sessions, but I think we might all have a little bit of new program fatigue, and this is a new program, and we are still figuring it out alongside you. And certainly at that point, it was brand new. So we're going to ask you for that, but for that information. But what I think one of the important things for you to know is that as a home PJ, the state still has to show that it's going to serve other qualifying populations. So it can't prioritize just one population across the board without showing how other resources are actually benefiting the other qualifying populations. That's why it's going to take a little while if you want to provide some kind of a preference or priority in your project. No limitations, please, as Ruby mentioned. When you start limiting a population, it just raises too many fair housing concerns, and none of us want to be in that particular boat. So it's going to ask you how much you're requesting in HOME-ARP funding. And so there's 4 possible types of HOME-ARP funding that you might apply for in a non-congregate shelter project. Obviously, development is going to be one of them. We're assuming it's going to be, yes. Supportive services is an optional, as are the nonprofit operating assistance and nonprofit capacity building assistance. So you'll say, yes, we are requesting, no, we're not requesting. It is going to allow you to enter a request for operating assistance or capacity building assistance, but it will automatically enter the amount for development funding and supportive services from the other tabs in the workbook. So just be aware, you can't ask for one thing on page 1 and not back it up with the other worksheets in the workbook as you move forward with the application. And then at the very bottom of the cover page is a certification. And this is basically where we're saying, you know, your chief elected official or your board president or whoever is your signatory is basically, you know, signing their life away based on this project, and that there's and you know, maybe even their first child on top of that. I will caution you, read the certification carefully. It does speak to the fact that there is limited HUD guidance. You know, we are doing everything we can to interpret this. I would also say if you're reading through the notices and the other information and you're getting some kind of a different interpretation, please share that with us, talk with us about that. We want to make sure that we're being as clear as we can be. So it's going to say that in the certification, like, hey, we know that something could change. And, you know, we're going to have to roll with it if and when that occurs. If you're doing a rental housing project, this cover page is going to include a fifth possible HOME-ARP funding line item, and that's going to be that capitalized operating reserve. And I'm going to talk quite a bit about that as we move forward through the rental piece of the application. So I'm going to skip the checklist because it's a checklist, but I will tell you that tab 2, the checklist, it tells you what's a threshold requirement, what you have to attach. There are some items that we don't expect to see with the initial application. In fact, we don't want to see them with the initial application. We just want to be really focused on what's the project. Can we move it to the next level of underwriting? Does it meet all of our threshold requirements? So tab 3 is the project and site information. And remember, I'm talking about non-congregate shelter. I'll mention add-ins for the rental housing application. We're going to ask you about site control. A little different for HOME-ARP versus HOME, or perhaps some of the CB funding that you've been using is we are not accepting long-term leases unless the project is located on tribal lands, in which case we will look at those requirements separately. So you have to have site control. Deed, contract, option are all acceptable formats of site control for the purposes of the application. Seller information, we want to know if you're acquiring the property, who you're acquiring it from. So that would be included if you're using HOME-ARP funding for acquisition of the project, or if acquisition is part of the project and you're using HOME-ARP for other parts of the project. So we want to know that you are certainly letting the seller know that they have rights under the Uniform Relocation Act. We want to distinguish between a voluntary and an involuntary acquisition. No involuntary acquisitions in the HOME-ARP program. So you cannot do a eminent domain or taking if you are a unit of local government. Ruby, your hand's up.
Yes, so there's a question of why no long-term leases for site control?
In this particular instance, we wanted to make sure that the projects were going to be around, hopefully for longer than the required period of affordability, which has two different definitions depending upon whether you're doing non-congregate shelter or rental housing. So we were just like, let's just make it straight up. We want ownership. The leases can be a little too complicated with the other funding going in to a HOME-ARP project. Does that make sense?
Martina, that question came from me. This is Devonna. And
Hi, Devonna.
Sorry to be the bug, but we have a lease option for a 99-year leasehold interest from land from the city of Flagstaff with the goal and hope of utilizing home funds, maybe not HOME-ARPA, but something along the way to get those rental units built. And I was looking at this, and so it's a pretty significant disappointment to hear that that project's not eligible for funding. So that's why I have the question.
Okay, well, I think that it's a significant policy question, Devonna, and we can look at it. And then we'll put something out clarifying whether or not, you know, we're looking at changing that or not. How's that?
I was just going to say the same thing, Devonna. I made a note about it. We'll talk about it internally and put out a clarification on that.
Okay, so I don't need to send you guys a written email requesting you to look at it.
No, you're good.
Rock on. Thank you guys so much.
You're welcome. Okay, so we want to know about the seller. We want to be sure that it's an arm's length transaction. If it's not an arm's length transaction, we'll be having discussions with you about appraisals and review appraisals and how those things are looking in terms of the related party. We're going to ask you about the land and the buildings that are being acquired or rehabilitated. Are they occupied? This is HUD money. Occupied structures are going to be subject to relocation. I'm going to talk a little bit more about relocation when I talk about cross-cutting regulations. I will say that it's the department's policy to not take on projects that require at least permanent relocation. We will certainly entertain a temporary relocation in order to get a project completed. However, we're really looking not to be involved in relocation, and we have a policy that says that exact thing, and it goes with the consolidated plan. There's that term again. If you are demolishing any buildings, there's a 1-for-1 replacement requirement if any of the units are low income. And that doesn't apply to SRO units. So, you know, if you were, say, acquiring an old motel and decided, and it was currently being used as low income kind of short-term occupancy, we wouldn't be looking at whether or not you had to replace that, because you wouldn't. We want to ask you about property amenities. So what's available on site? Is there a childcare facility, a playground, other types of amenities that may be available to the people who are occupying the shelter or the rental housing. We're going to ask you about current zoning. We expect that all projects will have the appropriate zoning at the time of application. However, we will accept projects that are subject to a variance or use permit. And we're going to ask you to tell us where you are in that process of obtaining a variance or a use permit in order to make the project happen. Because there's, you know, obviously lots of moving parts, and we certainly don't want to get into a situation where we're funding a project that has to go through a rezone. So no rezones, but variances and use permits are perfectly acceptable. We're going to ask you back to the written waiting list procedures. So we're going to ask you, you know, how you plan to select people for occupancy. And then the rental application is going to add questions about unit amenities. So we want to know what exactly is going on inside of the units. And, you know, are you providing ceiling fans, washer, dryer hookups, those sorts of things. And then if it's a new construction project, a rental housing new construction project, we're going to ask you about the site and neighborhood standards that apply to all new construction projects that are HUD funded. And these requirements are going to have to be backed up if you're doing a rental housing project in the market assessment. But you need to be aware that these apply if you are doing a new construction rental project. They're really focused on making sure that we're locating projects in appropriate areas with appropriate infrastructure, access to employment, hopefully outside of areas of minority or low income or poverty concentration, and in areas of opportunity. You're not prohibited from doing projects in locations that meet those criteria. However, it is frowned upon, and we will be looking more closely at it. So what are we going to ask you to attach for the project and site information? Your document evidencing site control, independent appraisal report if the project includes acquisition. And again, it doesn't matter if that acquisition is HOME-ARP funded or funded with something else. There does need to be an independent appraisal conducted. And because these are HUD funds, a review appraisal is required. You can ask your appraiser at the beginning if they have somebody that they work with to do review appraisals. Some appraisers will do them and some will not. So you want to be asking that question on the front end. So two-phase appraisal for non-congregate shelter. Actually, it's going to be three-phase if you're thinking about converting the project to rental housing. I'll talk about that in a moment. So lots of appraisals going on, but that review appraisal is mandatory. We're going to want to see the title commitment or report to make sure that there's nothing going on with that particular property that might make it difficult to place CC&Rs, covenants, conditions, and restrictions on the property that implement the HOME-ARP requirements, or that otherwise might cause problems moving forward with the HOME-ARP project. We're going to ask you for the zoning verification. If there is occupied buildings on the property, a project relocation plan is required. This is also one of those areas where if you are looking at potential relocation, definitely talk to the department about what you're looking at, what the type of relocation it is, who you're relocating as an individuals or businesses, so that we can provide you with the proper guidance. There is a handbook that HUD puts out on relocation, actually a well-written handbook, and you can certainly get more information there, but do contact the department first. And then we're also going to ask you to attach the termite inspection report, because it is Arizona and we do have termites. And so we want to make sure that inspection has been completed. These are all eligible project costs if your project does indeed receive HOME-ARP funding. So you can look at being reimbursed for these expenses as you move forward. Now okay, Ruby, I thought you had a question. So I'm skipping tab 4, which is the timeline. I think it's quite self-explanatory how a timeline works. Want to make sure though, going back to what Ruby said about you're wanting to make sure that you're showing that you're starting within 12 months, 24 months if you're a nonprofit organization requesting that special funding. And that you're going to be able to be completed within 48 months, and that you're going to be occupied within 6 months of project completion. So all very important requirements to keep in the back of your mind when you're completing the timeline. Ruby.
I just wanted to jump in here because I did mention this earlier and you're mentioning it again now. with the way market conditions are right now and it being very challenging with labor shortages, especially in rural markets, we have received tremendous outreach from general contractors in saying that it's been, the construction schedule and or timeline has been delayed. So that's just something to keep in mind as you plan your project, as you plan your schedule, because these are hard deadline requirements that the department can't waive. These are dictated by the program. So it's very important that you're really monitoring your development team, your partners, to make sure that when you engage them, that they can commit to being able to get the project done within the required timeline, so then you all can get it occupied and habitable by the 6-month deadline. So we appreciate the market challenges right now. We hear about them every day, but just be mindful of that, because we would hate for you to move forward and then have that obstacle and roadblock and have to return the funding.
Thanks, Ruby. Yeah. Everybody's favorite topic of conversation, cross-cutting requirements. I am not going to spend a boatload of time on cross-cutting regulations, but I want you to be very aware of their existence, how they might impact your project, and the considerations that you want to keep in the back of your mind as you're proceeding with a project application. So first and foremost, HOME-ARP development projects are subject to the Part 58 environmental review requirements. And your project is either going to be categorically excluded or an environmental assessment. If it's new construction, it's environmental assessment. You can count on at least 90 to 120 days for that clearance to take place. And it can be a little shorter for categorically excluded, but I would think that a categorically excluded project is probably going to be maybe a single family acquisition or maybe a smaller project, something with less than 4 units in it. So be aware that the Part 58 environmental does take time. If you have not worked with the HUD environmental review requirements, you might talk to your unit of local government. Most units of government are familiar with environmental review requirements, as are the rural councils of government. They may be able to help you or refer you to somebody who can help you if this is a new thing for you. It is. I would recommend that you get somebody with experience to do this for you. The department also requires a phase 1 assessment be conducted. And the best way to do the environmental process is to really do the phase 1 first, because a lot of the information from the phase 1 is going to feed into that Part 58 environmental review. The phase 1 assessment does need to look at asbestos and lead paint if the project is acquisition and or rehabilitation. Obviously, if you're acquiring a project that was recently constructed, you can forego those 2 requirements, but in general, we're going to want to make sure that they're clear of asbestos and lead paint. So going back to the relocation and real property acquisition. Voluntary sales only. I mentioned that earlier when I touched briefly on relocation. One thing that seems to confuse a lot of people is that when a voluntary sale is done, people seem to think that the seller has no rights because it is a voluntary sale. But there are some rights that they do have, like a right to accompany the appraiser and to review the appraisal report, and also to not sell if that is an option that they wish to take. So be aware that there are additional requirements that a lot of people kind of overlook when they're acquiring a property. Occupants also have to be notified of their rights. And this is regardless of whether you intend to move them, not move them, permanently move them, temporarily move them. All occupants have the right to be noticed, and that you will find all of that information in the HUD handbook. And this is why I highly recommend that you contact the department and talk to them before you proceed with a project that has occupants in it. In looking at relocation, you also want to make sure that you're incorporating any relocation costs into the development budget. They are eligible project costs, and in some cases, they may also be eligible supportive services cost if somebody's not eligible for URA relocation assistance. Ruby.
So there's a question, and we might need a little bit clarification on this. Is there a team at the Department of Housing that can partner with a nonprofit to assist with the application process for possible tenants? So why I said we might need a little bit of clarification, I'm not sure if the question is about the application in general, what we're talking about, or when you're renting or bringing in the tenants to a project after it's built. When renting, okay. We do have our compliance division. Martina, do you want to, that can help answer questions, but no, there's no group that can facilitate reviewing applications, or there's no team members at the Department of Housing that would be directly involved with that process. Martina, do you want to add anything there?
Yeah, so just to clarify, the question is there somebody at the department that can help us
when they're renting to tenants, that application process?
Reviewing applications for tenancy? No, there's not. So that goes back to that waiting list and selecting people in chronological order of the date of their application, and then determining, are they a qualifying population? Do they meet other occupancy requirements? What I highly suggest that you do is look to Public Housing Authority administrative plans. They talk about how they manage their waiting list. Administrative plans are reviewed by HUD all the time. They tend to be follow kind of very strict guidance, and they are what I would call a safe harbor for selecting applicants for occupancy in NCS or tenancy and rental housing from your waiting list. So that's where I would look. The Department of Housing has a PHA Section 8 admin plan posted on their website. If you go to the PHA, you might want to look at Public Housing Authority plans. They also have, there's admin plans for Section 8, and then there's admissions and continuing occupancy plans that are done for public housing. And those provide kind of, they're generally, people are selected from the waiting list in a very similar sort of way. So either of those types of documents might provide you with good guidance. Okay. So back to our ever favorite conversation, cross-cutting regulations, federal labor standards, Davis-Bacon wage rates, apply if there are 12 or more HOME-ARP units, and this is non-congregate shelter and rental housing. So if you have a non-congregate shelter and it has 12 units in it, and you might have 24 beds, you know, I don't know how many beds it's going to have, but if it has 12 separate units, the federal labor standards are going to apply, and you are going to have to follow that very specific process. Ruby.
I knew this tab was going to bring up the questions. So what is the process if there is asbestos found? There would have to be a remediation plan.
There would have to,
yeah. You want to go ahead, Martina?
No, you go ahead, Ruby.
Okay. So you would have to stop activities if they had already started, but you would have that found in your phase 1 prior to construction. If it was revealed that the site and or existing buildings, if it's a rehab, had asbestos, you would have to remediate that before you would begin construction. You would provide a report that it is clear, and then move forward with construction activities. That's definitely something that's critical in the pre-planning, pre-development phase that needs to be taken care of before activities are started.
And you do want to make sure that your contractor, if it's lead paint or asbestos, you do want to make sure that you are hiring a qualified remediation contractor. It is also highly likely that you will be dealing with some level of relocation, maybe temporary relocation. Keep that in the back of your mind when you start to encounter these conditions that certainly increase costs, and make sure that you include the cost of remediation in your budget for certain. Okay. So more on cross-cutting regulations. So again, want to make sure that you are aware of these. I mentioned, I discussed the demolition or change in use earlier. Procurement and contracting, if you are a local government organization or a nonprofit organization, you must have written procurement policies and procedures that comply with the 2 CFR 200, which is really the guidance, uniform administrative requirements. So you want to make sure that you have those procurement policies in place. We are going to ask you to attach them so that we can see. A lot of nonprofits went through the process of developing procurement policies and procedures. 2 CFR 200 has been around for a long time, but you do want to make sure that they got updated to comply with the 2 CFR 200. If you are a nonprofit organization or a local government organization and you've already done some procurement, you want to make sure that you followed your procurement policies when you did the procurement. If you didn't follow your procurement policies, it is very likely that we will throw out the procurement and make you start over, not something that we want you to have to do. So make sure you are following your written procurement policies, local government, nonprofit. The HOME program, this is where a lot of that overlap is, and HOME-ARP, you do have to include minorities and women to the extent that it's possible and practicable. So there's lots of different ways that minority and women business enterprises can be included in a procurement, and this should be also in your written procurement policies. And then we want to make sure that when you are procuring something, if you are formally procuring, that you are including the federal labor standards and Section 3 requirements in that procurement. This is particularly important when we're dealing with contractors. They do need to know on the front end that they have to meet the extraordinary reporting requirements associated with the federal labor standards and the Section 3 requirements. So the federal labor, the ADO has handbooks for both labor standards and Section 3 requirements. You can find those on the department website under publications. Most of them are under community revitalization section. So, but if you just type in, federal labor standards handbook into the search, it will take you to the appropriate location. Civil rights and non-discrimination requirements apply to HOME-ARP projects. What that means is you have to have an accessible site and buildings, and that includes both the project and any sites where supportive services are being provided. So they have to be accessible. That means, you've got to have appropriate sidewalks. You have to have the ability for people to access the service at the particular site. And then the buildings need to be accessible as well. We often get the question, well, our services are provided by a service provider, in a building that is historic and we can't make the changes that are necessary. You will want to have other opportunities to accommodate people with different disabilities if that is the case. So just be aware of that and make sure that you're including the cost of disability accessibility improvements in the budget. So also contact, when you're working with your unit of government and you're looking at permits and they're doing plan review and all of that, they may have additional requirements. So make sure that you're aware of those as well. more fun with cross-cutting regulations, financial records and audits. So going back, you have to have a system that complies with the Uniform Administrative Standards, your financial management system. And we're going to ask you in the application when your most recent audit is, and this is going to apply to nonprofit and for-profit applicants. If you haven't had a recent audit, you can say we haven't had a recent audit. This may be more likely for a for-profit than for a nonprofit. Hard to say, depends upon how much federal funding your entity is receiving. Section 3. Section 3, there were new requirements issued last year. And there's been a new handbook written that's posted on the department website. What you need to be aware of in terms of Section 3 is at the moment that you have $200,001 HOME-ARP or other covered funding in the project, you do have to comply with the Section 3 requirements. And what those are really, in terms of ADO and how we work the Section 3 requirements, it's all about tracking labor hours. We want to know how you're going to track labor hours, and then what kind of actions are you taking to engage Section 3 eligible workers, Section 3 eligible businesses in the procurements. And again, there's that handbook there. Ruby.
So this Section 3 discussion, there are a lot of changes, and we do periodic training on Section 3 and the requirements and reporting thereof. So I will drop a link here in just a second. I've been doing that along as Martina, you've been talking with a bunch of different links, but we will be having a training on Section 3 at our Arizona Housing Forum in August. And so I encourage you, if you are looking into utilizing this resource or other sources from the department, that you come to that session. If you are attending the conference, it will be very helpful to you to navigate, and also to see if you might even need to engage a consultant to help with this process, because it's very, very, very challenging. So I just wanted to add that in there.
So, I will add to that if you have a project that is already doing labor standards, it's going to be a lot easier to comply with Section 3 than if you don't have a project that it includes labor standards in it. And we will talk more about that at the session at the conference. So we'll do a plug for that particular session. Please attend. So look at the Section 3 handbook. Hopefully it is very clear. Section 3 is going to apply not just to HOME-ARP funds. So it's any kind of covered assistance going into the project. So if you've got some other kind of CPD, HUD CPD resource, it's generally what you're going to see perhaps going in there. Maybe local governments putting some CDBG funding into infrastructure in support of the project. Anything that bumps you over that $200,000 mark in your project will subject your project to Section 3. Home and HOME-ARP both require a drug-free workplace policy. There is a drug-free workplace policy in the HOME-ARP program summary. If you don't have one, now's a good time to have your board or adopt one for your entity. I want to spend just a few minutes on conflict of interest. You do have to have written standards of conduct regarding conflicts of interest, and there's two kinds of conflicts of interest in the HOME-ARP program. So the first is a non-organizational conflict of interest. So this occurs generally when there is a family tie or some kind of a financial tie between a HOME-ARP project or program beneficiary and somebody perhaps that's on an officer or agent of your organization. So these kinds of conflicts have to be disclosed. There is a whole process that has to be gone through. So just as an example, in the regular home program, there was a person who applied for assistance through a home project who happened to be the nephew of the organization's board member. And because of that relationship, there was a whole disclosure process that had to take place. And it was quite some time before approval was received for that nephew to get the assistance that he needed. So be aware of this, be cautious. It can be particularly challenging in very small communities to avoid a non-organizational conflict of interest. Organizational conflicts of interest, on the other hand, exist when you have two related organizations working on a specific project, and you are referring or cross-referring people to projects. I think the best example that I can provide what an organizational conflict of interest might look like is you have a subrecipient supportive services provider, and they cannot refer people for supportive services to only your project, if you recall from the supportive services discussion. So they can't condition the receipt of services on occupancy in a particular project that's owned by that related party. And it could be the HOME-ARP project, or it could be another project that's owned by the entity that owns the HOME-ARP project. Little circular, it is a kind of a confusing, it was to me anyway, kind of a confusing discussion in the particular notice issued for HOME-ARP. So be aware that this organizational conflict of interest language is specifically in the notice, and you want to be cautious in terms of how people are referred to projects that might be owned by you as an applicant or somebody related to you. Confidentiality, I think all of us who are dealing with HUD programs these days, confidentiality, you have to have a mechanism for ensuring that people's information, applicants for tenancy or occupancy, are kept confidential and secure. There are additional confidentiality requirements when you're dealing with populations that are fleeing or attempting to flee, who meet that definition. So you just want to make sure you have confidentiality procedures in place, ways to make sure that people's personal information is not exposed. In terms of cross-cutting regulations, this was a very long list that I've already gone through. I want to say that the rental housing also adds VAWA emergency transfer procedures. If you are unfamiliar with VAWA emergency transfer requirements, basically what it says is that you will help somebody who is a victim of domestic violence to be able to move, and you have to have those procedures in place in advance. So if the situation does arise, you can follow those particular procedures. Again, I would go, if you don't have them, you're unfamiliar with these requirements, I would go back to a Public Housing Authority's Section 8 Administrative Plan or ACOP, and they will describe in detail VAWA emergency transfer procedures that you could adopt for your project. HUD approved. All right, so we are going to ask you to attach a lot of information regarding cross-country, I didn't tell them, I'm ready to go on vacation, cross-cutting regulations. We're going to ask you to attach a lot of different things. So in terms of the Part 58 environmental, we want to see the FONSI request for release of funds, FONSI finding of no significant impact. You know, it's one of those terms that we get used to when we work in the industry. If it's an environmental assessment or request for release of funds, categorically excluded. We're going to want to see the Phase 1 environmental assessment. The FEMA floodplain map, if it's applicable, your demolition one-for-one replacement plan, if you are demolishing or changing a use, your procurement policy, conflict of interest standards, all of the things that I just mentioned. We're going to want to see those attached. We have to make sure that you are in a position to comply with the cross-cutting regulations before we move forward with your project. And we can provide some technical assistance. Hopefully this workshop will have been helpful. Okay, that was before I move on to project team and organization capacity. I just want to make sure that there's no lingering clarifications needed on cross-cutting regulations. No, okay. So project team and organization capacity, this is both a threshold and an underwriting criteria. We want to make sure you have the capacity to do the project. Obviously, if you're a nonprofit organization requesting that, what I'm going to call special assistance, we will work with you to allow you to put this information together. The application itself asks you to include the name, title, organization, phone number, contact information for each of the team members. It's also going to ask you about any litigation or bankruptcies in the past 7 years and any pending litigation or judgments. The department may, if these conditions exist, decline funding. We want to know if there's any financial or family ties between any of the parties. That goes back to that conflict of interest, and also making sure that you are collecting appropriate fees for the work that you are completing. And all of these requirements are the same for rental housing. Ruby.
So that's you with that last sentence was perfect, because the question came up, is this only for non-congregate that you're going through, and rental housing, and then you're layering in the additional requirements for rental housing? Yes, otherwise we'd be here for 6 hours. So these tabs are the same, but where there is a distinction for rental housing, Martina's highlighting that. So
yes, thank you, Ruby.
Yep.
Okay, so what you're going to want to attach, a list of the projects completed by the team. So your team is generally your principals, your developer, your builder, your architect. When you think about the development team itself, we want to know what projects you've completed in the past. What's the name of the project? Where is it located? You might not have any. You might be, one of those fledgling nonprofit organizations that we're working with. The types of funding that were used in the projects, the unit and bed mix. Obviously, for rental housing, this is going to be the unit mix because bed mix is not going to apply. And then any services that were provided in conjunction with the projects that are on the list. We're going to want a list and description of any litigations or bankruptcies and any pending litigation or judgments. An explanation if there are family or financial ties. We want to make sure that we are not moving ourselves or you into a conflict of interest situation. And then if you have new team members, so maybe you have a team that has never worked together in the past, for each of the development team members, you're going to want to provide that same exact list as you would for the team, except for you're just doing it for the individual team members. This is critical to the department, being sure that you have the capacity and understanding, particularly if you're a nonprofit organization, what kind of capacity building assistance you might be needing. All right, now for the really fun part, the development budget, right? This is where we get into the meat of how the money is going to be used. We anticipate that the bulk of the HOME-ARP funding will in fact be used for development sources. So we are in the development funding sources as a tab 7. We're asking you to tell us about the committed funding that you have and the tentative funding. So committed funding is, they're all in. Tentative funding might be conditioned on receipt of HOME-ARP funding. It might be conditioned on receipt of something else, or maybe, serving a specific population, so maybe getting that preference moved forward. We want to know if it's a loan or a grant, and we want to know who the lender or the funder is for each particular funding source. You do have to attach term sheets, letters of commitment for each funding or financing source that you're telling us about here. And that would include, if you're a developer and you're investing equity funds, there's equity in the project, we want you to demonstrate to us evidence that the equity is there. And these requirements are all the same for rental housing. Down here, this total funding, you cannot enter an amount in here. It's going to carry over from the development budget, and that's also going to carry over to that first tab. So you're going to want to be paying a lot of attention to the development budget. It might be someplace that you even start the development budget, and the operating budget might be the two places where you actually start the application, just to make sure that you're going to be able to make it work for HOME-ARP, particularly as it relates to the financial requirements. So here's you'll see when you get into the development budget itself, it's broken into sections. This mirrors with a few little twists the LIHTC development budget. So if you are a LIHTC developer and you're contemplating including HOME-ARP in a LIHTC development, hopefully this will not throw you for a loop, because it will be essentially the same. What I want to point out is a couple of unique line items, perhaps, for non-congregate shelter. So the first is appraisals. I already mentioned there's appraisal required, a review appraisal if you're doing acquisition. But you're also going, if you want to convert the project to rental housing, which is an option in non-congregate shelter, there's a period of time that you have, and you have to tell us on the front end, yes, we want to convert this to non-congregate shelter. No, we don't. You will need to have an after rehab value appraisal, because that after rehab value appraisal is going to tell us what the minimum restricted use period is before you convert the project to rental housing. And hold on one second, Ruby. And then under the direct construction budget, this is an important thing to understand about non-congregate shelter. So there's the rehab that's going to make it occupancy ready, right? It's going to say it's going to meet all of the local building codes and all of the habitability requirements, which are far less, I promise you, than the local building codes are going to be. We want to make sure before you occupy that the project meets the base requirements. And then for non-congregate shelter, we can capitalize using HOME-ARP funds, a replacement reserve. And that capitalized replacement reserve is going to be based on the capital needs assessment. And the capital needs assessment must specifically look at the useful life of major systems in the project, and if they will expire essentially during that restricted use period. So anything that is identified as needing to be, major system that is identified as needing to be replaced during the restricted use period will be funded through a capitalized replacement reserve. One of the things, say you're just, well, we're just doing an acquisition project. If you are, unless it's a new construction acquisition, you will want to have a capital needs assessment conducted for the project so that you can get the reserve capitalized. Remember, there's no HOME-ARP operating support for non-congregate shelter projects, but there is this ability to fund the capitalized replacement reserves, which should ultimately reduce your long-term operating costs, because we're going to be paying for the replacements during the restricted use period. Ruby.
We had a question, Martina, and we talked about this earlier about the funding opportunity, and is it for urban and rural right now, or how is it? And the February 1st, 2023 date we talked about. So can you just spend a second talking about this being a statewide opportunity first, or focus on balance of state first, and and when it'll switch over?
Yeah. So to clarify, The opportunity at the moment is for areas of the state that do not have a home PJ. So that is going to be outside of, no projects. I'll say it in the reverse from what I said it earlier. No projects in Yuma County, Pima County, Pinal County, or Maricopa County until February 1st, 2023. That is when we will start to entertain applications for projects from the additional 4 counties that also receive HOME-ARP funding directly from HUD. I will note for you that every home PJ goes through this allocation plan process that the state went through last fall to submit the plan that was approved in March. I believe that every home PJ in Arizona except the city of Phoenix has submitted their allocation plan to HUD. Some are in the process of taking comments right now in Pinal County. Others are already approved. So if you have a project that's in one of those counties that has a home PJ, you want to look at their allocation plans, talk to their folks who typically run the community planning and development programs like CDBG Home, etc. Your hand is still up, Ruby. You're done? Okay. All right, so this is a little unique to the non-congregate shelter. Again, really get a capital needs assessment, make sure that you are identifying all of the systems that are going to need to be replaced during the restricted use period so that we can help your project to operate long-term. Our goal. And then the other thing that you're going to see different just for rental housing is the capitalized operating reserve. And I will talk about that a little bit more when I talk about the rental application. Continuing into the development budget. Actually, we'll let Susan ask a question. We have a little time. Susan, you're muted. Maybe you didn't need to raise your hand. Okay.
I just wanted to get a little bit more clarification of what you mean by non-congregate organizations.
Non-congregate shelter?
Shelter, yes.
Yeah, so non-congregate shelter is exactly, it's emergency shelter it could be for any qualifying population, although I would anticipate we're not going to see people who aren't already homeless or fleeing some kind of situation occupying. So it would meet basically the emergency shelter requirements that you might see under COC or ESG programs. And we are going to ask for a description of how the project is actually going to operate. So it's short-term shelter.
Perfect. Thank you.
Long answer to a short question. Yes. So looking again at the development budget, acquisition, we're going to ask you about what's the cost of land, buildings, and closing costs. Cannot exceed the appraised value for obvious reasons. In HOME-ARP, just as in the home program, no off-site improvements. So if if off-site infrastructure is necessary, you should be looking to your unit of local government, perhaps for some CDBG funding to help support that. You can do on-site infrastructure to hook to infrastructure that is at the property line, but you cannot go off-site with HOME-ARP development funds. One of the really nice things about HOME-ARP is there's no per unit cap on development expenses. We do expect them to be reasonable. And when we look at reasonable, well, there's been a lot of shelter projects and a lot of rental housing projects funded with special resources and new resources over the last couple of years, plus the long-term funding that's come through LIHTC and National Housing Trust Fund and other resources. We're going to be looking to make sure they're reasonable. So, please don't submit something with extraordinary costs unless you have a good rationale and can explain why that is. So here's a little bit on the underwriting, your builder contractor fee. This includes profit overhead, general requirements, 15% of the net construction costs, and that's defined as the construction costs less the contractor fee and any building permits. So you want to make sure that you're not exceeding this cap on the builder contractor fee. So talking about rehab, I already mentioned this kind of making it occupancy ready, and then the capitalized reserve. We want to make sure that you have a decent construction contingency in there that is at least, or not, that does not exceed 10% of your project hard costs. You may have an exception to that in terms of an acquisition or rehab project. And if you do need to go over that 10%, that's going to need to be documented and will most likely be documented in the capital needs assessment itself. We wouldn't anticipate, of course, with costs doing what they're doing, we'll hopefully have an opportunity to work with you if you do start to experience significant cost overruns, which would be nothing surprising in today's market. Okay, so architect fees. In non-congregate shelter, we're talking about beds, right? In rental housing, we're talking about units. So architect fees are limited depending upon the number of beds in the project. So larger projects, we anticipate smaller fees just in general, because those fees are spread across more units than they are in a small project. So you'll see the limitation on architect fees, and then you'll also see a limitation on developer fees. And while this says in NCS in parentheses applies equally to rental housing, so note that the developer fee in a larger project, which we are saying is 61 or more units, is up to 15% of total development costs, less the developer fee itself. And if it's a smaller project, up to 60 beds, up to 20%. So we're trying to make it possible for you to do a small project if you'd like to do a small project and still be appropriately rewarded for your efforts with a developer fee. You may defer the developer fee. This is for those of you who are unfamiliar with it, you can defer the taking of your fee and leave it in the project. If you do defer the developer fee, we expect you to take that deferral in equal installments. If it's a LIHTC project, we'll defer to the waterfall provisions in the agreement. And we need to see, obviously, that you've got enough cash to actually take the deferred fee in equal installments over the life of the project, which is the restricted use period. So watch the developer fee and make sure that you are not asking for more than you are allowed to ask, and make sure that if you are deferring it, that you've got sufficient resources to actually be actually paying yourself back for it. There is nothing that prohibits you from taking your developer fee and setting it aside to help meet operating costs in the future. So be thoughtful about whether you want to defer or go ahead and take. It's really going to depend a lot on cash flow and how the project is going to operate. Sherry.
Hi, I'll be handling the chat for now. We have a comment from Marianne. Given the costs of materials, equipment, supplies, labor, will ADO consider a 15% contingency, especially considering the rural areas where gas and transportation costs are much higher?
Mm-hmm. Good question, Marianne. And I think just like the last policy question that we got, we'll talk about it. We'll put our heads together after our workshop today, and we'll issue some guidance on whether or not we would consider a higher contingency. It was a good question.
Perfect. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so what do you have to attach for the development budget? Property design standards, drawings, and our plans. Obviously, don't submit your big roll of architecture plans. Give us elevations, give us information. We're assuming you're moving, if it's new construction or it's a substantial rehab, you're moving it through the local approval process, and all of that is being reviewed there. It is important with a non-congregate shelter project that you anticipate or plan to convert to rental housing, that the project actually be suitable for conversion to rental housing. So the design standards and the drawings and plans are really important to us being able to review that information. The capital needs assessment, which I've talked about considerably. If there is a capitalized operating reserve for the project. So we anticipate most non-congregate shelter projects will be having some type of operating funding support, and it might be annual operating support or periodic operating support, or you might have some kind of an agreement that capitalizes operating support. So if you do have that capitalized operating support, we're going to want to see the agreement governing that reserve. And then for rental housing, there's also, we're going to want to see any information that you have about a capitalized replacement reserve. How are the funds committed to it? How are the funds dispersed from it? So that's what's going to be in those agreements. We're going to want to see both of those, operating and replacement. Okay, the non-congregate shelter program description, which is tab 9. So no market assessment for non-congregate shelter. So we ask you questions. What's the need for the project? How did you determine that the project is actually needed? We want to know what's the number of sheltered and unsheltered individuals from the most recent PIT count, because it is non-congregate shelter. So we just want to make sure that, and we know the PIT's not the most reliable source, but we still want to be sure that you're engaged with that system and understanding how that system operates. So we want to see what those counts are. And then any other information that you have that describes or explains the situation that you're addressing with the non-congregate shelter. If you looked at CDBG-CV when that was out and we were doing the emergency and transitional shelters with that funding, these are basically the same questions that you will have for the HOME-ARP NCS. Because it is recovery funding, and because there are remaining concerns about infectious disease, we want to know, kind of what are your protocols? How's the facility designed to prevent the spread of disease? We're going to ask you, what are the number of people that you're going to be planning to serve, and how long are they going to be able to stay? 60 days, 90 days, probably, not a whole lot longer than that in terms of a shelter environment. We'd hope that we would be moving people to a permanent situation by then. And then we want to know, how are you going to identify qualifying populations to occupy the project? How are you going to coordinate with other systems of care? I want to take a step back and tell you, beware actually of the coordinated entry process. Do not use coordinated entry as your primary referral source. Remember, with people who go through the coordinated entry process, if you aren't familiar with it, they're prioritized. There is a preference, there's a prioritization process that takes place. So if you are taking referrals from the coordinated entry system and there are people who are reaching the, prioritized in the coordinated entry process, you are providing a preference or a priority. And unless your project has that preference or priority associated with it, you don't want to use strictly coordinated entry. You want to take referrals from lots of places. And you might be able to share information with the continuum of care in terms of people who are applying for assistance and get access to a broader list, not just those people who are prioritized. So just be very careful when you're taking referrals to the project, how you're taking them and who you're taking them from. So the non-congregate shelter operating budget, we want to know obviously about, where are you getting the money to operate the shelter? We do not allow you to charge fees of occupants, so do not use that as a potential source of funding for your project. We're going to ask you about operating costs. It's going to include any debt that you might have taken on for the project and any deferred developer fees, which are basically debt as well. We don't really anticipate that a non-congregate shelter project is going to be able to support debt. We're really looking, keeping our fingers crossed you're going to operate through the entire restricted use period. So it might be unusual, but there may be circumstances where you would see debt. And then it's going to ask you to provide information on general admin, utilities, other, basic expenses of operating the shelter, and to explain your assumptions that go into that particular cost. So as an example, if you have, somebody who does maintenance at the shelter, that's going to be a staffing cost. You may have a maintenance person, but you may have a maintenance contract, which would be separate. When you look at the budget, there's a staffing line item in there. And the reason I mentioned maintenance is because the maintenance person is unlikely to also be providing supportive services. And in HOME-ARP, we decouple the supportive services from the project operating budget. So this is a little different than if you're doing a LIHTC project and there might be supportive services in the operating budget. It's not the same with HOME-ARP. So they're separate. Hopefully that was made clear why when we went through the supportive services, but there's a whole different system of tracking with HOME-ARP. We're going to ask you to tell us about repairs and maintenance. So these are really non-capital. So, the easiest way to look at this is, distinguish the stuff that the major repairs that you're going to be doing based on the capital needs assessment, and look at regular repairs and maintenance, replacing locks, washers and faucets, things like that just happen as things wear out on a regular basis. And then we're going to ask you about taxes and insurance. So this is the same basically for rental housing in terms of how we underwrite the project or look at the project and its ability to remain in compliance for the entire restricted use period. Income is increased 2% annually, costs increased 3% annually. Given today's financial environment, this is probably very generous. But it's hard to say at this point, what's going to happen in the future. This has been our standard in the past, and we're going to stick with it for the HOME-ARP projects. If at any point in this 15-year period, we see a negative net income to the project, so in other words, operating costs exceed operating revenues, you're going to have to show us that you've got a operating reserve or some kind of an escrow account. If you've had other shelters in the past, you can describe to us how you've been able to secure funding for those particular projects, or you can explain to us how you're going to raise the necessary funds. It is our responsibility to make sure that you are able to operate for the entire restricted use period. So we can put some faith in what you are telling us, but show us the money is going to be a really important kind of factor here. We're going to want to see commitment letters that say for the operating funds, firm or tentative, both. Okay, we have roughly an hour left to go through the HOME-ARP rental housing piece of things. I need a few minutes a break, as you may also need a few minutes break. So it is 11:26. So I'm just going to take actually just like 5 minutes. And so we will be back in 5 minutes. Welcome back, everybody. So just enough time to grab some water and let's talk about HOME-ARP rental housing. Save the best for last, perhaps, or some of you may be cringing just thinking about it, but we will see. So let's talk about first the market assessment for HOME-ARP rental housing. It is a required attachment. Everything on this particular slide is going to apply to both large projects and small projects or projects that serve exclusively HOME-ARP qualifying populations. So there's two types, as I just alluded to, a large project, 31 or more HOME-ARP units, might serve multiple populations, might not, as mentioned earlier, it could be market, could be not market, could be lots of different kinds of mixes. Or small projects, or small projects, 30 or fewer units, or projects that serve exclusively qualifying populations, different requirements. These requirements on this slide apply to both types, not less than 6 months old. So rapidly changing market conditions, especially right now, a lot of people moving into the area, things are into the state, things are changing rapidly. We want you to use current data, that's census, Claritas, ESRI, primary data. Great if you have primary data. If you're going to use some other type of data, you're going to need to document the reliability of that data. The market study must look at the demand for all of the units in the project, not just the HOME-ARP units, because if the HOME-ARP units are attached to other types of units, obviously they need to stay there for the minimum compliance period for the rental housing, and their HOME-ARP units aren't going to stay there if the entire project isn't still operating in 15 years. We're going to look to see that in the market study, you've looked at the rents and that they're within the regulatory limits. So your analyst will need to make sure that they are documenting the rents. We want to see achievable occupancy rates. So those are really based, at least initially, on how many qualifying populations and other households are captured in the primary market area. So we would expect that the project as a whole, the capture rate is not going to be more than 10% of the households in the market area, 25% for any specific bedroom size. So obviously, if you have, a mix of bedroom sizes, we want to make sure that you don't have a bunch of one-bedroom units when there's few single-person households in the area, as an example. And then not more than 50% of any unsheltered or sheltered count in the last pit, and that would be an emergency or transitional housing. We anticipate, although there is no qualifying population preference, we anticipate that a large volume of populations who are going to occupy this rental housing are going to indeed meet the definition of homeless. So we say not more than 50% of the count. That 6-month occupancy has been mentioned multiple times. Kind of the way it works in HOME-ARP is the same in home. We say you've got 6 months to fully lease your units. There is a little wiggle room in there. If you're not fully leased in 6 months, you have to submit a plan to be fully leased up within the next 6 months. And if you are not fully leased in that 12-month period, it is drop dead time, and those HOME-ARP funds get repaid to the project because it is a non-compliant project. So in today's market, we're not too terribly concerned, at least on the initial end of things, but things can change very, very quickly. We want to make sure that the project is not likely to have some kind of an impact in other comparable types of projects in the primary market area. And then, as I mentioned earlier, make sure that you're supporting in your market assessment the site and neighborhood standards that are required of new construction projects. So that's either type of market assessment, large project or small. So the 31 or more units, this is going to look very familiar to you. If you're a LIHTC developer, we want to see the market study conducted in accordance with and by the National Council of Housing Market Analysts model standards. The link to that is in the slides at thehousingonline.com. We expect that the market assessment will meet the content data analysis and conclusions requirements of those particular standards. If it's a LIHTC project or there's some other source of federal funding, including some kind of a guarantee or insurance product, we will take the study that you submitted or market assessment that you submitted for the other funding as long as it meets the 6-month and appropriate data requirements mentioned in the previous slide. It's a little different for HOME-ARP rental housing projects is the market assessment requirements for a smaller project. We wanted to make it more feasible for small projects to happen in rural Arizona, and allowing for this kind of abbreviated market assessment is one of the ways that we hope we can help make that happen. If you have a small project, you are welcome to submit a market assessment that is the same as what would be required for a large project. However, if you want to submit an abbreviated market assessment, what it has to be included in that particular assessment is seen here on this slide. I am not going to go through and read this to you. However, it's important that the study understands and your analyst understands HOME-ARP qualifying populations, the assumptions that are being used in terms of what income level they're going to be at, what household sizes they're going to be at. It's probably very appropriate in a smaller project and perhaps even in a larger project to really be looking in some depth at the PIT data, at household sizes, at unique characteristics, so that you can get your mix, your unit mix right, and capture those qualifying populations who are obviously in need. There's going to be you want to have a primary market area defined for your project. Market assessments are going to have a primary, often will have a secondary. So where are the majority of folks going to be drawn from? In some areas, this could be an entire county, but think geographically and think reasonably in terms of how people move throughout through your market and gain an understanding of your market. If you're doing a rehab project, we're going to want to know about current rents, vacancy rates, other losses. So make sure that you include that information so that we can see, like, we're able to charge this kind of rent. We're staying, 95% occupied, or whatever the conditions as it may be. If you have a waiting list, so this would probably be most applicable to a nonprofit developer, you might have people lined up, looking for rental housing units. It's a good place to get your information for your market study from. If you do not have a project waiting list, you're going to have to provide detailed information on income increments in the project, because that's going to help us to understand whether or not the rents that you're proposing are appropriate based on the populations that you will be serving. So that's it for market assessment. Now as you get into the application itself for rental housing, you're going to see this tab 9 unit mix, and I would consider this probably the most crucial tab to get right from the start, because it feeds into the operating budget, the rent schedule, and ultimately to your ability to secure development, the amount of development funding that you would like for your project. So this is, I'm going to go through some examples of how this particular tab works, and in addition to how you enter information into it. Not at the top of the worksheet in tab 9, but at the bottom, it's going to ask you to specify whether or not your HOME-ARP units will be fixed or floating. So if you know the home program, you know that there are fixed or floating units. And I would say where the majority of overlap occurs between home and HOME-ARP is the cross-cutting regulations, which we've discussed, and then the rental housing. So you'll see a lot of the requirements kind of moving over. So fixed or floating is absolutely essential. You choose this at the beginning. Fixed units, it's like we have unit, 2A, 2B, and 2C. Those are our 3 HOME-ARP units in the project. They never fluctuate. And this impacts how compliance works. You can be out of compliance when you have somebody who is no longer a HOME-ARP qualifying population, or if it's a low income unit goes over income, and still be in compliance if it's fixed. With floating, it just means that the projects move, or the HOME-ARP units move throughout the particular project, and the next available comparable unit is rented to somebody who's a qualifying population. I'm going to take a step back because I realized that there's this underlying understanding that I want to cover very briefly about HOME-ARP rental housing. So Ruby mentioned this early, you're going to have your HOME-ARP units in the project. It might be part of the units, it might be all of the units. At least 70% of the HOME-ARP units have to be occupied by a qualifying population. So that's when I say a HOME-ARP, I'm going to say HOME-ARP QP. That's a HOME-ARP qualifying population unit. Up to 30%. It doesn't have to be a 70-30 split. It probably won't be. It may be necessary. Up to 30% of the HOME-ARP units may be occupied by low-income households, so households who are not qualifying populations. So the low-income households go up to 80% of the area median income. They can pay the high home rent, so there's a higher rent limit on those particular units. And that mix is there to help projects remain in compliance in terms of cash flow when that is necessary. So I want to distinguish between the HOME-ARP qualifying population units and the HOME-ARP low income units. And so you'll see QP and LI as we go through. So you're going to have fixed or floating, and that's going to apply to both the QP units and the low income units. So the amount of this tab, the minimum number of HOME-ARP units or the maximum amount of HOME-ARP funding that you are going to be eligible to receive from the department is going to be calculated in this tab based on the data that you enter. And so I want to be sure that you understand that there are different ways that this can be calculated. One is when the HOME-ARP units are both proportionate and comparable in the project. So what does that mean? Proportionate means that the HOME-ARP, the number of HOME-ARP units and the development and the funds invested in the project is proportionate to all of the units in the project. So if it's a 100% HOME-ARP, it's going to be proportionate, but we want to make sure that it's proportionate. And then there's a comparability test. So what does comparable mean? Comparable means if you have two different types, two different sizes of, say, 1-bedroom units. One is a little smaller, one's a little larger. Those units have to be proportionately distributed throughout those different residential unit sizes. So if you put all of your HOME-ARP units are going to be the smallest units in your project, you do not have a proportionate and comparable project. And we're not going to just simply divide the number of units in the project by the total of, or the HOME-ARP funds going into the project by the total development cost to identify how many units. We're going to do a residential floor area calculation instead. And that's going to change either the amount of home funds that you're going to get or the number of HOME-ARP units you're going to have to include in the project. The other thing that's going to be calculated in tab 9 is, are there sufficient qualified population units? So let me give you an example. So in this particular example, you'll see when you go into the spreadsheet, it is complicated, but a lot of the information does move forward. It's going to ask you to enter. This may look a lot like the LIHTC unit mix worksheet. The number of bedrooms, bathrooms, how big the unit is. So in this particular project, we can see that we have different size studios, 1s, 2s, etc. in terms of their residential floor area. This is a calculation that's going to occur within the sheet. You're going to want to enter in these columns how many of the units are going to be by that floor area, how many units are going to be total, how many are going to be HOME-ARP QP, qualifying population units, with no project-based rental assistance. And the reason this is going to be important is a HOME-ARP QP unit that is receiving project-based rental assistance cannot also receive funding through the capitalized operating reserve. The operating reserve is strictly for HOME-ARP QP units with no project-based rental assistance. It is not for any other unit in the project, including HOME-ARP low-income units. So be very aware of what you're entering into this sheet. So you're going to say no project-based assistance with project-based assistance. We have some low-income units in this project. Maybe we need it in order to make the project cash flow. Are there other restricted units without project-based rental assistance or with project-based rental assistance? So, you could have a LIHTC project, you could have a project with another funding source in it that also has restrictions on it. It's going to do, the spreadsheet is going to do calculations to let us know, do you have at least 70% of your units as a qualifying population? The other thing that it's going to do is, because the units are not comparable, your mix of HOME-ARP units, QP and LI, is not comparable in terms of the entire residential floor area of the project, and your investment it's going to calculate the actual amount of HOME-ARP funding that you can receive based on the information that you entered in the unit mix. So you're going to get a calculation that says, because you don't have a comparable mix of units, even though you have more HOME-ARP units in the project than are required, you can only, based on residential floor area, receive this amount of HOME-ARP funds. Even though you've asked for 2.4 million, you're going to get less than 1.8 million. So what this means is you're probably going to want to go back and revisit that unit mix. If you genuinely need that $2.4 million in order to make the project both feasible, getting it built, viable, operating in the long term, you're going to need to rearrange your unit mix, or you're only going to get $1.7 million, or just under $1.8 million in HOME-ARP funds, and we're still going to hold you to what you proposed for the 29 units. Okay, so that's that not comparable calculation that's important to understand. So here we've got this like even distribution of units, HOME-ARP units, in relation to all of the other units in the project. So we've got 75 units. This is how they're distributed. We can see that they're very evenly distributed throughout the project in relation to the different residential floor area of the varying units. So I want to add one other thing about comparability that I didn't state at the beginning. Comparable, you can always go bigger, right? But you can never go smaller in terms of comparability. So if you wanted to, have a bunch of larger units in the project, that's just great, but you can't go a bunch small and have it not count against you, because that residential floor area is going to hurt you. That calculation is going to hurt you. So we've got this in this particular scenario, we've got that comparable and proportionate. We've still got the meeting the minimum number of HOME-ARP qualifying population units. But in this case, you can indeed receive your full allocation that you've requested of HOME-ARP funds. In fact, you'd be eligible for just a little bit more, but we're going to go with what you asked for. So we'll fund you fully, and then you will have 28 HOME-ARP units, one less than in the non-comparable calculation that I showed you earlier. I want to make a point about the minimum number of HOME-ARP units in the project, and because we always round up, right? Even in home, it's a little, if you had a 27 minimum HOME-ARP units, 27.1 as your minimum HOME-ARP units, you would have to have 28. You're always rounding up anytime you go over a whole number. So the spreadsheet won't automatically do that because it doesn't understand rounding in that kind of a format. So one time that we humans are actually a little bit ahead maybe in our thought process. So always round up the units. If you've got an uneven number, always round up, and you're going to be more likely when you have proportionate and comparable units in your project to receive the full amount of HOME-ARP funding that you requested. So that, I don't know if there's any questions in there or if everybody's just getting really tired, but I want to make sure that we're good there before I move on to the rent schedule. Okay, so in terms of the rent schedule, the information from the tab 9, that whole unit mix information that you entered there is going to carry forward, as you can see, and it has here. There's no opportunity for you to input any information at the very beginning, but you do have to enter the county in which the project is located, and the county is important because that's where the HOME-ARP rents come from. That is where you're going to provide the information in the actual rent schedule to show that you are in fact in compliance with the HOME-ARP requirements. So we want you to use so the way the spreadsheet is set up is there's an assumption that year one is not a stabilized operating. Obviously you're leasing up, there's lots of things going on. We expect you to be fully in a stabilized operating mode in the remainder of the minimum compliance period, so years 2 through 15. So this first year is going to be important in terms of the information that you enter, and I'm going to show you that in the next spreadsheet. But you want to make sure you're using the most recent rent limits, and they're on the department's website. They're the same as they are for home. So the HOME-ARP rents use home rents. There's a lot of overlap in this particular part of the program. Okay, so what you are going to be entering into the rent schedule is the information about the rents during year one and during the stabilized operating, or actually not during year one, just during the stabilized operating period, sorry. So you're going to want to go back to that rent sheet that you have for your county that shows you your rent limits. Qualifying population units are assumed to be at the low home rent once you are in a stabilized operating mode. Home low income units are assumed to be at the high home rent once you are in a stabilized operating mode. If you have a HOME-ARP qualifying population with a unit that has project-based rental assistance, if you're lucky enough to get that, you can go up to the high home rent on that, or the rent paid by the source of the project-based rental assistance. So that project-based rental assistance could be very valuable to your project. So you're going to enter that information. So remember, we're looking at Coconino County. You are for this column that asks you about allowance for tenant paid utilities. That information is actually going to go into tab 11. So you are going to have to complete that information in order to support what you're putting here in the rent schedule. So once you enter the information, so here's the low home rent, here's the high home rent, here's your other restricted units, and any unrestricted units obviously have a higher rent associated with them. Usually it's going to be only the HOME-ARP QP units with no project-based rental assistance that are going to have a different rent than any other restricted units in your project, even when you're mixing funding sources. So, well, wait a second here. Yep. So this sheet will end up calculating for you your gross monthly income and your annual rent. So it's going to carry that information forward to the operating budget in the workbook. Once you get to the operating budget, you can add in any other sources of income that the project might have, laundry, parking, other kinds of fees that might be charged in your project. We're going to ask you to estimate the vacancy loss and bad debt. We're looking at a 7% maximum, or you can explain it. A larger project, we anticipate seeing generally percentage-wise, a lower vacancy rate than we might see in a small project, because one unit vacant in a small project is a lot of vacancy. So you can go above the 7%. You just want to explain it, why you're going above the 7%. There's the utility allowance schedule is in tab 11. It's going to ask you to tell us about your annual expenses, and then debt service and deferred developer fees. Again, equal installments only, and reasonable and customary expenses. Not a lot different than what you're going to see in a non-congregate shelter project in terms of the basic requirements. It's just how things are calculated is a little bit different, or a lot of bit different. Just like in a non-congregate shelter project, income is going to be increased at 2% annually, costs at 3% annually. So this will, in the operating budget, is going to calculate the average per unit expenses across all units. And this is important to calculating the base capitalized operating reserve that you might be requesting, because we use the average of all years of the stabilized operating as an average expense over the minimum compliance period as the expense factor when calculating the operating reserve that you might be eligible for. So this is going to basically happen for you, the calculation, after you have entered the additional information regarding vacancy, additional income, and expense information into the project. Okay, so what do you have to include when you're looking at the rental housing operating budget? Your letters or term sheets for any operating funding that you might have. If you have project-based rental assistance, we need to see the letters of interest or letters of commitment. Those letters need to demonstrate firm start and end dates. If you have a 20-year project-based rental assistance agreement, you would have a 20-year compliance period. So you want to be, why we need to look at that, where is that cutoff? And if your project-based rental assistance agreement is for a shorter period, then of course we're going to want to see how that reflects in later years, in the later years of the minimum compliance period. So those firm start and end dates are very, very important. Any support that you have for the utility allowance calculation. HUD has 4 methods, and these are specified in that tab. Probably the simplest method is just calling the utility company and giving them the information and them telling you about your units and them telling you what to expect in terms of monthly utility costs. Most complicated is going to be an engineer model where you actually have an engineer determining utilities for you. And if you are using an engineer model, you need to be aware that that engineer needs to be unaffiliated with your project. So, not somebody that you as part of the project team. We're going to want to see affirmative marketing procedures. Any HOME-ARP prices, just like home, you've got, 4 or more units, you're going to be doing affirmative marketing procedures for your rental housing project. We want to see a tenant selection plan. This goes back to that waiting list, picking people taking people off the waiting list in the chronological order in which they have applied, unless there is a preference. So we want to see your tenant selection plan. And then any agreements that govern operating reserves or replacement reserves that are already in place for the project. So I want to make a point about operating reserves already being in place for a project. If you have a project that has an operating reserve associated with it, you cannot ask for a capitalized HOME-ARP operating reserve. So this is an important distinction to make. Obviously, if you've got an operating reserve going, it can be a HOME-ARP can make, the units can make contributions to that reserve as any other type of unit would, but there is not going to be the capitalized reserve available to the project. So this is an important distinction to make. The other thing about the operating reserve, that capitalized operating reserve that I want to mention is that HOME-ARP can fund a replacement reserve, just like it would for any other units. There's that capitalization on the front end. It's not like non-congregate shelter. We're going to capitalize for the entire minimum compliance period. It's just like it is for any other unit in the project. So that initial contribution to that reserve. So that if, however, HOME-ARP is providing replacement reserve funding, then that replacement reserve funding needs to be removed from the operating reserve calculation. So hopefully that makes sense, but there's lots of things that go into, lots of expenses that go into that operating reserve calculation. One of them is the replacement reserve, and we cannot fund both for you. That's going to be one or the other. Okay, so the operating reserve calculation is the last rental housing application tab unique to rental housing. So I want to spend a little time in showing you how how to enter information into this particular sheet. So your stabilized rents that you entered back in the rent schedule for years 2 through 15 are going to show up in this sheet. They're going to automatically calculate for you. The average unit operating expense is going to just plug right in here as well. So that information is going to come out. So the only information that you're going to need to enter into this sheet if you're requesting a capitalized operating reserve is the year 1 rent information. So what we're saying is do this the easiest way possible, which is to go to the Department of Housing website, download the National Housing Trust Fund program rents, and enter in this column the lesser of the National Housing Trust Fund rent or the poverty rent, because there's 2 different line items there, and some unit sizes the poverty rent is going to be lower than the NHTF rent. So you're going to want to look at both lines in there. Normally we would just look at the NHTF rent. We're looking at both of them for this year 1. So you're going to take the smaller of that number and you're going to back out the utility allowance for that unit. So in the first year of operating, you're going to see a very low, generally speaking, a very low rent amount. So that information gets entered in here. The spreadsheet does all the remaining calculations that are necessary. It's just vital that you enter the correct information in here. Make sure that you're, considering QP units with no project-based rental assistance versus those with, because that's also going to factor into this sheet it's going to carry forward. And in this particular project, it's not a real project. In this particular project, the sheet has calculated that the maximum reserve that can be requested and that you can put into tab 1 is this roughly $1.17 million. So that amount goes into your agreement with ADO for the project. So it's in addition to any development funds that might go into the project. It can be revisited over the first 8 years. Remember, the department has 8 years to fully expend funding, so that in that 8th year they could commit a larger amount if we're finding that this initial capitalized reserve is insufficient. If you do ask for a capitalized operating reserve, we do expect that there will be a separate account for that reserve. You will not be allowed to automatically draw from the reserve. You will have to provide information to ADO's asset management folks and to explain your calculations that are going into that reserve draw, and then you will receive approval, hopefully, to draw the funds that you need for the reserve. So it's something to keep in mind, that you don't just get the capitalized reserve and we never look at it again. It is something that is managed in cooperation with the department. So be aware of those things. So that is what I have for you today. And we were anticipating we were going to go till 12:30. It's only 12:10. And rather than coming back in 35 minutes, I think maybe we should just roll into the Q&A session. And I don't know if there's anything in the chat that people want to ask or that people have asked that we have not yet answered. Otherwise, this is your opportunity to kind of do get a little free TA, upfront TA, and pick our brains, what's left of them after this morning. So, all right.
That's great. Thank you, Martina. We are up to date with the chat. So as Martina said, if you have any other questions, you can raise your hand or you can submit them through the chat, and we are here to help.
It's a lot of information that we have thrown at you this morning. So, I understand if you're just a little, maybe not quite there to ask questions yet, but we want to make sure we have that opportunity.
Will we send the slides out? We'll post them on our website under the HOME-ARP where the application materials are. We will add the slides there, and we'll also be posting this webinar so you can reference it at a future date. So that video will be posted as well.
All right.
That's a good sign usually. It means that we covered the materials thoroughly and answered the kind of questions as we were going. I want folks to know this isn't your only opportunity to ask questions. You can send emails to myself, Ruby, Martina too. She's an amazing resource, and we are so lucky to have her assisting us with this HOME-ARP process and the HOME-ARP plan and application material. So thank you so much, Martina. And we got some positive feedback. So good good job presenting great content too. Thank you, Tina.
Excellent, excellent. So, and as I mentioned earlier, you know, if you see, you know, if you read the notice, and you say, you know, and I don't agree with that interpretation, definitely let us know. You know, we are really, we're low on guidance, and so we're working off of our best conservative interpretation of the notice itself, and any alternate interpretations, just like policy questions, like why are you doing that? We're very open to entertaining those. We want to make this work for you.
You bet. And we did have a question if the application is out now. It is, it's on our website. And I think the link was dropped in the chat, but I will drop it again just in case. So y'all can have that as a reference. And then it looks like, did we get another? Is this presented every Friday? Again, in the afternoon today. This was our only presentation. So it is our application workshop for the HOME-ARP NOFA that was released, and it will be on the website. So if you want to review it, it usually takes us a little bit to get it out there. We'll have to go through the IT process to post it to YouTube, and then it goes live on our website. So stay tuned in the next week or so to have that up and running, and you can reference it as needed. Hi, Susan.
Hi. Okay, Martina. I appreciate, you know, the training and all that, and the program was explained as per guidelines and requirements. And I'm a visual person, so my question would be, I mean, I know that it's not, you know, I guess my question is, like I said, I'm a visual person, and now how do you see? Can you just kind of paint of the vision of what an example of a program or a project that would best be described using these funds, or the HOME-ARP program or funds? How would it, what does that particular project or program look like? I know we explained it as a requirement and guideline, you know, kind of, but again, I just would like to get more of a visual of what is, you know, or if there's any programs running similar to what's provided through this grant, this program.
Okay, I think, are you talking NCS, rental housing, both, either?
Right, yeah.
Okay. And so before I go and answer that question, I think that if we see a lot of the same questions coming up repeatedly, we may entertain doing kind of a TA session or some workshop kind of follow-up to provide clarification. And also, before I answer that question, I do want to encourage you to go to the HUD Exchange, to the HOME-ARP website. This webinar they did on preferences in May is on the website, along with the two other pieces, or that one other piece of guidance that they've issued that's unrelated to the allocation plan. So I think, you know, the HUD is pedaling as fast as they can, just like the rest of us are. So, you know, but do keep an eye on what's on their website, because they may be releasing additional information. As they do, we will be keeping up on that, and we may end up sending something out saying, hey, you should be aware that, you know, the way we interpreted this has a unique interpretation in and of itself, kind of like the preferences thing. So going back to your question, Susan, about, you know, what does let's do a non-congregate shelter project. I would say it might look like one of the hotels to housing projects, or CDBG, CV emergency shelter projects that have been implemented over the last couple of years. So in a rural area, it might be smaller. You know, ideally it's going to be nonprofit operated. That's not to say for-profits are prohibited, but in a non-congregate shelter project, we generally anticipate that it's mission driven and therefore operated by a nonprofit organization. The difference between what you might see in a hotels to housing project or a CDBG-CV project is that the supportive services provider might be outside of the shelter. It might be the services provider itself might not be affiliated with the actual shelter provider, and those services are going to be available throughout the community, including to occupants of that non-congregate shelter. So that would be like, you know, be the big difference. It could also, we saw a couple of, you know, relatively small shelter projects, and you might see this particularly in a very small rural community. It might be a single family home. So people are in, you know, separate bedrooms, but they have hopefully their own sanitary facilities, but they're in separate bedrooms, and they're able to access the kitchen facilities and other things for their meals, and those meals are maybe brought in, or the groceries are purchased as part of the project, and the meals are cooked in-house. So that's non-congregate shelter. And I think there was a question that came up in my explanation, and I'll get to rental next. So Sherry.
Yes. So the question, good question, is if they have a congregate shelter and would like to convert to non-congregate, can they do that with this funding? And then also, Susan, I can connect you with some resources. So y'all may have not met Susan. She is our new underwriter. We're excited to have her join our team. So she started a few weeks ago. So welcome to everyone, Susan, our new underwriter with the rental team. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Hi, Susan.
Bye.
Okay, so go back, Sherry, to was there a question there?
Yes, the first part of my, comment was, can they convert congregate to non-congregate?
So you can convert from congregate to non-congregate. You just want to make sure that that conversion isn't violating some prior use agreement that you have in place with whoever funded the congregate shelter. You know, if it's in some kind of a restricted occupancy period or some kind of special funding period, you're not gonna, you want to check with the funder of that project. You also are going to want to check with your operating funders. How do they feel about your changing it up? I think in this day and age, most operating funding sources understand the necessity almost of non-congregate versus congregate shelter opportunities. So and then the final is, of course, going to your unit of local government and talking with them about your zoning, whether or not it's appropriate for that project to be converted to non-congregate shelter, what their requirements are going to be. It might be your first stop, because if it's not properly zoned, it is not going to happen, because we don't want rezones. We will, if they're willing to work on a use permit or a variance, that's awesome. Continue with that particular process, but definitely start with the planning and building folks at your local government or county government.
Yeah, great points. Thank you, Martina. We have a question from Will. So does the prohibition against project preferences limiting QAP or QP mean senior projects are not acceptable? And if so, would ADO consider a 55 plus project given the 80-20 restriction? Yeah, that's a good question.
Yeah, so we have a 55 plus project with an 80-20, and we're looking at mixing HOME-ARP funds in there. So our qualifying population is going to be a subset of this 55 plus population that's going to be in the project. Okay.
Well, yeah, I'm guessing, Will, your QP would be in addition to the senior. Can you clarify that? I'm thinking, his QP would be, one of the qualifying populations, and then maybe the other LMI units would be 55 plus.
Right. I I think that is something that we need to have a conversation about, Will. I'm sorry, but there's always the funky requirement, we're talking about age restricted, which is, you don't restrict based on age, except for there are, some exceptions in our substantially similar fair housing laws in Arizona. So I think we need to maybe talk with our attorney about that and see how that might be made to work.
That sounds good. We can include that, Will, in our follow-up with a couple other of the feedback we got today. So we'll post that through an information bulletin with these items that require some follow-up, so everyone can see how that panned out and everyone can have the same information. And then we have another question from Kenya regarding if they have a scattered site proposal, can they separate out? So I'm guessing if it's non-congregate, can they have a location for women, a location for men, a location for women with children and men with children? This might be another one we should follow up on too. Yeah.
I'm going to say, my initial gut reaction is no, but I think that we will follow up just to get legal clarification on that, because you are offering, different locations. A project, how you define it as a project is going to be a really important consideration in this. And so if a project is a single undertaking, common financing, all of the development pieces are the same. We might be more likely to make that work. If you're looking at them as separate projects, they're going to have separate financing for them. That I can tell you straight up, no. So that's going to be a really big factor in, I think, answering that question. And maybe Kenya, you can tell us, what are you thinking?
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. Just to clarify, so say if all the properties were similar, but it'd be hitting the different demographics. So you know how some women may not want to live with men, or women with children may not want to be with, men with children, just to separate, but it's all under the same project. And like, say the properties were still like the same, you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. I think it's going to be less, Kenya, about whether they're the same than it is going to be about whether or not you're looking at it as, say 4 units comprised in one project. Does
Right.
that? Yeah. So if you're looking at it all as one project, that's a question that I think we can pose to the attorney and get some guidance from the attorney. If you're looking at it as not all common funding, not all common development team, then I'm going to tell you straight up no, because it's a limitation.
Okay. That was the first one.
Yep.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you all. Good questions. So we'll stay on. Yeah. Sorry, Mark. Go ahead, Martina.
Oh, well, so Susan's, the second part of Susan's question is like, what do you envision for a rental housing project? And because of the cost of development, because of the limitations on the amount of home money we have, I would say that, it's going to be a small project, or it's going to be a smaller number of HOME-ARP units in a larger project. Because we're serving primarily rural areas, not all rural areas in Arizona anymore are small markets. Here, I live in Yavapai County. We were a small market 10 years ago. We are no longer that. So, I think it's going to be appropriate to the market area. We're not going to see 60 units in St. John's, but we might see 60 units in Prescott Valley, right? With some of those units being HOME-ARP units. Because of the cost of construction, the high development costs, we really don't anticipate, we're going to see a whole lot of units out of this. So we really would anticipate we'll probably see 1 or 2 projects that are either wholly HOME-ARP, all HOME-ARP units, or a proportion of the units are HOME-ARP in relation to a larger project. I can't say a whole lot more about it other than, you know, there's just a limited amount of money. And it's one-time funding as far as we know. You know, we don't see any additional HOME-ARP funding coming down the pike.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Well, we are not seeing any more Q&As come in on the comments on the chat, and haven't seen anybody raise their hand in a little bit. So I'm thinking maybe we could wrap up. And as I mentioned, you can always, as you're going through the materials yourself or formulating your applications, you can reach out via email, and we are happy to help you all. So stay tuned for that information bulletin with the items we discussed as follow-up policy items or questions that we need to research a little bit more. And thank you all for attending, and thank you for your time today.
Thank you, everybody. Good luck.
Thank
you.
you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks,
Bye.
Martina.